There is a man inside a wooden ship, and the rain has just begun. He is not young. He has spent more of his life building toward this sound than most people spend on anything. And now the first drops are striking the roof above him, and the world outside is still breathing. And the world inside is 8 people, and every creature that draws breath. And the door behind him has already been shut, not by him, by something else. Outside, people are going about their day, not because they are stupid, not because they cannot see the clouds, because the mind protects itself from what it cannot afford to believe. And a man building a massive wooden structure in the middle of dry land is easier to laugh at than to take seriously. They laughed. Now the rain is falling, and the man inside the ship is not celebrating. He is listening, because somewhere beyond the thickness of that wooden wall, the world he has always known is becoming something that has no name yet. This is the story most people think they already know. The boat, the animals, the rainbow at the end. But that version leaves out the parts that matter most. It leaves out the world that made the flood necessary. It leaves out what it actually cost to be the one man standing when everyone else had stopped. It leaves out what Noah did after the water receded and the ground was dry and the mission was over and he had to figure out who he was when there was nothing left to build. It leaves out the vineyard, and the tent, and the silence that followed. The story of Noah is not a children's story about a boat. It is the oldest and most honest account we have of what survival actually does to a person, of what it means to be chosen to outlast the world you love, of what gets carried through the water even when the water takes everything else. We are going to tell it from the beginning, and we are not going to stop at the rainbow. Chapter 1. The World That Learned to Forget. There is something the story of Noah requires us to do before we meet the man himself. It requires us to understand the world he was living in, not as a backdrop, not as a stage set of generalized wickedness that we can nod at and move past, but as a real place, with real people, making real choices across real generations, arriving slowly and then all at once at a condition that the text describes with a single word, a word that changes everything about how we read what comes next. Go back further. Go back before the problem. Go back to the world as it was designed to be. Because you cannot understand what went wrong without first understanding what was right. Genesis does not begin with Noah. It begins with a garden, with light being called out of darkness, with water being separated from land, with living creatures filling every corner of a world that the text describes, at the end of each day of its making, with the same word. Good, good, good. Very good. The world started good. That matters more than we usually let it matter, because it means the world Noah was born into was not a world that had always been broken. It was a world that had been good and had moved. By degrees, by choices, by the slow accumulation of what happens when people with genuine freedom consistently use that freedom in one direction, away from something it was not supposed to move away from. The distance between the garden and the flood is not measured in miles. It is measured in decisions. And here is what those decisions looked like from the outside. Genesis chapters 4 and 5 give us a world that is, by every visible measure, advancing. Cain builds a city. His descendants develop agriculture and animal husbandry. Jabal becomes the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother Jubal becomes the father of those who play the harp and the flute. Tubal-Cain forges instruments of bronze and iron. Read that list again and notice what it actually is. It is civilization, the emergence of the organized, creative, tool-using human world that we recognize as the foundation of everything that came after it. Music, metallurgy, agriculture, urban life. These are not small things. These are the achievements that every subsequent generation built upon. The world before the flood was not a primitive world. It was a sophisticated world, a world that had figured out how to make things, how to organize people, how to extract beauty from raw material and usefulness from the natural world. A world that was, in the ways that human achievement measures itself, genuinely impressive. And it was dying from the inside. Not quickly. That is the thing about the kind of decay that takes a whole world down. It does not happen quickly. It happens the way a tooth rots. From the center outward. Invisible at first. Then uncomfortable. Then catastrophic by the time anyone calls it by its name. Genesis chapter 6 gives us the name. The word is Hamas. It is usually translated into English as violence, which is accurate but incomplete. Hamas in Hebrew carries a broader meaning than physical harm. It describes a condition of systematic wrongness, a state in which every boundary that was supposed to hold has been pushed past. A world in which the people with enough strength to take what they want have decided that their strength is sufficient justification for the taking. It is the word for a world that has learned to call force a form of order. And Genesis says it had filled the earth. Not a corner of the earth. Not a region. The earth. Genesis chapter 6. Verse 11. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Verse 12. God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. All flesh. Every direction God looked. The corruption was not a problem in one place that could be addressed by fixing that place. It had become the texture of the world itself. Now here is the question that most readings of Noah never quite sit with long enough. How does a world get there? How does a place that started good, that produced music and tools and cities, that contained within it people who loved their children and built things that lasted, arrive at a condition that the text describes as beyond the reach of correction? The answer is not that the people of that world were monsters. That would be easier to understand, and easier to dismiss. The answer is something much more uncomfortable. They forgot. Not all at once. Not on a single day when someone made a decision to abandon everything good. Slowly, generationally. The way a language loses words that it no longer has daily use for. The way a skill disappears when the people who practiced it stop passing it to their children. The way a value becomes a sentiment, becomes a memory, becomes nothing at all when it is no longer practiced in the specific, costly, inconvenient moments when practicing it actually matters. Genesis chapter 5 is, on the surface, a genealogy, a list of names and ages and the phrase he lived. And he had sons and daughters. And he died. Repeated across 10 generations. Most readers skip it. They should not. Because buried in that genealogy is a pattern. The lifespans are extraordinary. Centuries long. Which tells us these are not generations in the modern sense, but something more like eras. Long stretches of time in which the world had the opportunity to go in any number of directions and kept choosing the same one. And hidden in the list is one name that breaks the pattern. Enoch. Enoch lived 65 years and fathered Methuselah. And then Genesis says something about Enoch that it says about no one else in the chapter. He walked with God. Not he lived his years. Not he had sons and daughters. He walked with God for 300 years. And then he was not. For God took him. The text does not explain what walking with God means in practical terms. It only tells us that Enoch did it, and that the outcome was different from every other outcome in the chapter. Everyone else in Genesis chapter 5 arrives at the same final phrase. And he died. Not Enoch. One person in 10 generations walked differently. The text marks it without commentary, drops it into the list like a stone into still water, and moves on, because the next person the text will describe as walking with God is Noah. 2 people in the entire pre-flood world described with the same phrase. 2 people across an enormous stretch of human time. And what set them apart from the generations around them was not achievement or status or religious office. It was orientation. They were going the same direction as something that everything around them was moving away from. Enoch disappears before the flood. Noah is the one who has to live through it. That difference is not accidental. The text is showing us something about what it costs to walk differently from the world you are embedded in. One version of that cost is being taken out of the story before the hardest part begins. The other version is staying in it. Noah stayed in it. Now understand what that means in terms of daily experience. Noah was not living in a world of obvious evil, where the wrongness was visible and clearly labeled, and the choice between right and wrong was clean. He was living in a world of normalized wrongness, a world where Hamas had become the background condition of life, the way traffic noise becomes the background condition of a city, present and constant, and no longer registered as unusual by the people who have grown up inside it. He was living in a world where the people around him were not sitting in their homes, congratulating themselves on their corruption. They were going to work, raising children, making music, building things, living the lives that the world around them had defined as normal. And the normal had quietly, over generations, drifted so far from what it was supposed to be that the distance was no longer visible to anyone standing inside it. That is the world Noah woke up in every morning. That is the world he looked at when he stepped outside his door. Now, what makes Noah remarkable before we have even introduced him properly is not that he was perfect. The text does not say he was perfect. Not that he never doubted or feared or felt the pull of the world around him. What makes Noah remarkable is this. In a world that had learned to forget, he remembered. Not loudly, not performatively, not in a way that left any record of speeches given or arguments made or people convinced. The text preserves no sermons from Noah, no debates, no public stands, only the eventual fact of a man who, when God looked down at the world and found it filled with what it was filled with, was still standing in a place where he could be found. That is where the story of Noah truly begins. Not with the command to build, with the world that made the command necessary, and with the quiet, costly, unrecorded fact of a man who had not gone the direction everyone else had gone, in a world that had very good reasons for going that direction, over a very long period of time, with no visible evidence that staying put was worth it. The rain was still a long time away, but the world that would make the rain necessary was already complete. And somewhere in it, almost invisible against the texture of a civilization that had learned to forget what it was made for, one man still remembered, without knowing yet what the remembering would cost him, or what it would save. Chapter 2. The Sons of God and the Daughters of Men. There is a passage in Genesis that most people who tell the story of Noah quietly skip over. It sits at the beginning of chapter 6. 4 verse long, and it is one of the strangest things in the entire Hebrew Bible. Scholars have argued about it for 2,000 years. Translators have handled it with varying degrees of nervousness. Teachers have found creative ways to move past it quickly. We are not going to move past it quickly, because this passage is not a detour from the story of Noah. It is the diagnosis. It is the text's most specific attempt to show us not just that the world had gone wrong, but how it had gone wrong at its most concentrated and most visible point. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Read it slowly, because almost every word is doing something. Start with the phrase that has generated the most argument, the sons of God. 3 major interpretations have competed for most of recorded history, and being honest about them matters more than pretending the text is simpler than it is. The oldest interpretation, found in ancient Jewish texts and referenced in the letters of Peter and Jude in the New Testament, reads the sons of God as divine beings who transgressed a boundary they were never supposed to cross. They saw, they wanted, they descended, they took. The second interpretation, developed strongly in the rabbinic tradition, reads the sons of God as the righteous line of Seth, the descendants of Adam's third son who had maintained some connection to their origins. The daughters of man, in this reading, are the daughters of Cain's corrupted line. What is being described is not supernatural descent, but two human communities merging in a way that pulled the faithful line toward the corrupted one. The third interpretation reads, the sons of God as rulers, the powerful men of the ancient world. In the ancient Near East, kings were regularly described as sons of the gods. This reading puts the passage firmly in the human world and makes it a description of political and social power operating without restraint. Each interpretation illuminates something real. But here is what all three share, and what matters more than deciding between them. The action is identical, regardless of who the actors are. They saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Not they loved, not they asked, not they pursued and waited and were answered. They saw, and they took any they chose. That phrase is the sound of a world in which the concept of limit has become theoretical, in which the gap between wanting something and taking it has closed to nothing for the people with enough power to close it, in which the question of whether you are permitted to have a thing has been replaced by the simpler and more brutal question of whether you are strong enough to take it. This is Hamas made specific. This is the violence and disorder of the pre-flood world, shown not as an abstraction, but as a transaction. Someone wanted something. Someone took it. And the fact that the thing they wanted was a person, that the taking was a human life folded into someone else's choice without being asked, is precisely the point. The world the text is describing is a world where the strong have stopped asking permission from anyone, and the result of this crossing of boundaries is the Nephilim. The word in Hebrew is related to the verb meaning to fall, the fallen ones, or, in another reading, the ones who cause others to fall. Genesis describes them as the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, great men, famous men, the kind of men that the world around them celebrated and feared and told stories about. They were not celebrated for their gentleness. The men of renown in the ancient world were renowned for what they could take, what they could destroy, what they could build on the foundations of what they had taken and destroyed. Renown was the currency of a world organized around force, and the Nephilim had more of it than anyone else. So here is what Genesis is giving us in these 4 verses. A world in which the boundary between powerful and ordinary, between the permitted and the forbidden, between what belongs to you and what you simply want, has become permeable. A world in which the strongest members have decided that their strength exempts them from the rules that govern everyone else. A world in which the natural result of that decision is a class of individuals so celebrated for their power that the world has organized itself around them. Giants, heroes, men of renown, and God is looking at this world. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intention, only evil, continually. This is not a description of bad behavior occasionally producing bad outcomes. This is a description of a world in which the interior life of human beings has become oriented entirely in one direction. Not that every person was committing visible atrocities every moment, but that the imagination, the planning, the deep motivational structure of the human heart had aligned itself away from what it was made for and toward something else entirely. The Hebrew word for intention here is yetzer. It is the same word used for the creative impulse, the inner drive that shapes what a person makes of their life. God is not just looking at actions. He is looking at the source from which actions flow. And what he sees at the source is a world that has forgotten what it was made for so completely that the forgetting has become structural. It is not that people are fighting against good impulses and losing. It is that the impulse itself has been redirected. This is what Hamas as a systemic condition looks like from the inside of the people living it. Not demonic possession, not deliberate villainy. The quiet, total reorientation of human desire away from its proper object, toward power and acquisition and the self as the center of everything. So gradually and so completely that the people inside it cannot see it anymore. They think this is just how the world works. They think the strong taking what they want is the natural order. They think the men of renown are worth celebrating. And then Genesis gives us verse 6. One of the most astonishing sentences in the entire Hebrew Bible. One of the most important for understanding what God actually is in this story. The Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth. And it grieved him to his heart. Grieved him to his heart. This is not the language of a dispassionate judge reviewing a case and determining that the evidence supports a verdict. This is the language of someone who gave something precious and watched it destroyed. The word translated as grieved is the same word used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for the kind of pain that sits in the body, that cannot be reasoned away. That is the natural response of a creature capable of love to the experience of loss. God is grieving over a world he made and loved and is now watching devour itself. This matters enormously for everything that comes after, because it means the flood is not the action of a God who is indifferent to what is being lost. It is the action of a God who is more aware than anyone of what is being lost, who has watched it happening with the particular anguish of someone who understood what the world could have been. The flood is not easy for God. The grief in verse 6 says everything that needs to be said about that. And then, at the end of verse 7, before we have met Noah yet, before we know anything about what God is about to ask of one particular man in this grieving and corrupted world, the text gives us 3 words that change the direction of the whole story. But Noah found 2 words in Hebrew, Wayimtza Noach, and Noah found, or more precisely, Noah was found. The verb is grammatically passive. The finding was not entirely on Noah's side. In a world where God is looking at the entirety of human civilization with grief, where every direction he turns reveals the same corruption, where all flesh has corrupted its way, there is this, a man who can be found, not a perfect man, not a man without the same human nature that everyone around him shares, not a man who has somehow escaped the fallen world he lives in, a man who, when God looks, is still in a place where the looking finds something, what that something is, and what it costs to be that something in a world like the one we have just described, is the story we are about to tell. The sons of God took what they wanted. The world filled itself with the violence that follows when the strong stop asking permission. God looked at it and felt it in his heart. And somewhere in all of that, a man named Noah is going about his life. We are about to find out what kind of man can be found when God looks down at a world like this and needs to find one. Chapter 3. The Man Who Was Seen. There is a sentence in Genesis chapter 6 that most readers pass over in 3 seconds. It is the most important sentence in the entire story of Noah. Not the command to build, not the dimensions of the ark, not the covenant at the end, or the rainbow, or the dove with the olive branch. Those are all significant, but they all depend on this one sentence. The sentence that makes everything else possible. The sentence that explains why this particular man, and not any of the thousands of other people alive in that world at that moment. Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. 7 words in English, 5 in Hebrew, and inside those 5 Hebrew words is a complete picture of what it means to be chosen, and why being chosen is nothing like what we usually imagine it to be. Start with the grammar. The verb is passive. Noah did not find favor the way you find a coin on the ground by looking for it. He did not earn it the way you earn a wage by performing the required work. He did not achieve it the way an athlete achieves a record through discipline and the accumulation of effort. He was found, something looked, and what it saw was sufficient. That distinction matters enormously, because it removes the question of whether Noah was good enough to deserve what was coming. The text is not saying Noah deserved the ark. It is not saying he had accumulated sufficient righteousness to qualify for survival. It is saying that when God looked at the world, Noah was visible in a particular way. Something in him could be seen when everything around him had become opaque to the seeing. Favor in Hebrew is chen. It carries the meaning of grace, of the quality that attracts positive attention, not because of the possessor's accomplishments, but because of something in their essential nature. Chen is what makes a person compelling, not in spite of their imperfections, but somehow through them. It is the word used when what is being described cannot be fully accounted for by any list of qualities. Noah had chen, and the eyes that saw it were the eyes that had just been described. In the verse immediately before, as looking at a world filled with corruption and grieving to the heart. Place those two things next to each other and feel the weight of what is between them. God looking at the world with grief, and then God looking at Noah with something else. That something else is the hinge on which the entire story turns. Now Genesis steps back and describes Noah in more specific terms, as if the text wants to show us what the favor was seeing when it looked. Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. 3 descriptions, each one doing something specific. Righteous. The Hebrew is tzaddik. It is a relational term, not primarily a moral one. A tzaddik is someone who is in right relationship, someone living in alignment with the obligations and commitments that define who they are in relation to others. Righteousness in the Hebrew sense is not about internal purity. It is about fidelity to relationship. A tzaddik is someone who can be trusted, who honors the connections they are part of, who lives up to what their position in the web of relationships around them requires. Blameless. The Hebrew is tamim. This word is important and easily misread. Tamim does not mean sinless. It does not mean perfect in the sense of having no flaws or having never made a mistake. Tamim means whole, undivided, complete. It is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible for animals acceptable for sacrifice. Not because they are supernatural, but because they are sound, without the cracks or deformities that would make them unsuitable. A tamim person is a person who is not split, not living 2 lives, not saying one thing and doing another, not presenting a version of themselves to the world that is different from what they actually are when no one is watching. The opposite of tamim is not sinful. The opposite of tamim is divided. Noah was undivided. In a world where division had become the fundamental condition of human life, where people had learned to navigate the gap between what was right and what was expedient with such practiced ease that they no longer noticed the gap. Noah was whole, the inside matching the outside, what you saw being what was there. And then the third description, which echoes back to Enoch in chapter 5. Noah walked with God, not walked toward God, as if God were a destination being approached. Not walked for God, as if God were an employer and Noah a servant. Walked with. The preposition is et, which in Hebrew implies accompaniment, the kind of side-by-side movement that happens between people who are going the same direction at the same pace and have chosen to go that direction together. Enoch walked with God. Noah walked with God. 2 people described with this phrase in all the generations before the flood, and what set them apart was not achievement or status or religious office. It was orientation. They were going the same direction as something that everything around them was moving away from. Now here is the complication that the text introduces and that most readings quietly smooth over. The phrase blameless in his generation. In his generation. That qualifier has generated an argument running through the Talmud and through centuries of commentary. And the argument has two sides that are both honest about what they are reading. One side says the qualifier is a compliment. It intensifies the praise. Noah was righteous and blameless, not in easy circumstances, but in that generation, surrounded by the worst the world had to offer. To be Tamim in that context required something extraordinary. The other side says the qualifier is a limitation. Noah was righteous by the standards of his generation. Measured against the people around him, he stood out. But the people around him had set a very low bar. In a generation of genuinely righteous people, his righteousness might not have been as remarkable. Both readings are honest. And here is what I find most important about the argument. Both of them turn out to be true. Noah is remarkable in his generation, genuinely and at great cost. Everything we are about to follow him through will confirm that. There is nothing small or easy about what this man does and endures. And Noah is also limited in ways that will become visible later. The story does not end with a perfect man walking into an uncomplicated future. It ends somewhere much more complicated and much more human than that. The text is holding both things in the same phrase. A genuine distinction, a real limitation, a man who is the best available thing in the world he is living in, and who is still, underneath all of that, a man. Now come the specific words of God to Noah. Genesis chapter 6, verses 13 through 18. God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. The command is specific. The dimensions are specific. The materials are specific. God gives Noah a blueprint, not a general directive. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, 3 decks, a roof, a door in the side. By any reasonable calculation, this is the largest wooden structure that anyone in the ancient world had ever been asked to build. It is larger than anything that existed in Noah's world. It is, by the standards of his time and place, an engineering project of staggering ambition. And there is something in the specificity of the instructions that we should not miss. God did not tell Noah the reason for every dimension. He did not explain the physics of why 300 cubits would float and 200 would not. He did not give Noah enough information to independently verify that the design was correct. He gave Noah the plans and trusted Noah to execute them. What God gave Noah was enough to work with, not enough to fully understand. That distinction is central to what faith means in this story. Noah does not build the ark because he has been given a complete explanation of everything that is going to happen and has evaluated the evidence and concluded that building makes sense. He builds it because he has been told to build it by something he trusts, with materials that are available. According to specifications he has been given, he builds it without being able to see the water coming. And then there is a detail in verses 17 and 18 that is easy to read past, but contains everything that matters about Noah's situation. God says, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. And then, in the very next verse, without pause, without transition, but I will establish my covenant with you. But, in the middle of the most total statement of destruction in the entire Hebrew Bible, a single word that changes the direction of everything. But I will establish my covenant with you. Covenant in Hebrew is berit, a binding commitment, sealed and unbreakable, made by the party with greater power, and creating an obligation that cannot be undone by the behavior of either party afterward. God is making a berit with Noah. Before the ark is built, before the first animal steps on board, before a single drop of rain has fallen, the covenant comes before the performance. Noah does not earn the covenant by building correctly and then receive it as a reward. The covenant is announced first, given as the ground on which the obedience will stand. Whatever happens between now and the end of what is coming, God is saying, I have already committed myself to you. That is the last thing God says to Noah before Noah begins to build. And Genesis chapter 6 ends with one of the quietest and most extraordinary verses in the entire story. Noah did all that God commanded him. One sentence. No record of how he felt about what he had been told. No account of how he explained it to his family, or whether they believed him, or what the neighbors said when the construction began, or how many mornings he woke up wondering if he had misunderstood something. Just the fact. Noah did all that God commanded him. The text is doing something specific with this silence. It is not hiding Noah's interior life because it does not exist. It is presenting the obedience as the complete statement. The obedience is the record. The obedience is what the text has to say about who Noah was in response to what he had been told. Because obedience of this kind, quiet and total and sustained over time, without the support of visible results or external confirmation, is not the absence of an inner life. It is the evidence of one. The man who was found when God looked at a grief-filled world is not a superhero. He is not a specially constructed religious figure. He is a man who had been walking in a particular direction for long enough that when the moment came, the direction he was already going was the direction the moment required. That is all. That is everything. The ark is not yet built. The water is not yet coming. The door is not yet shut. But the man who will build it, who will walk through the shut door into whatever comes next, has been introduced. He is quieter than you expected. He is more ordinary than you expected. And he is the only man in the world still going in the right direction when the rain begins. Chapter 4. The Flood That Memory Kept. There is a question that serious readers of the Noah story eventually arrive at. And it is not a question about faith or science or whether a wooden boat of those dimensions could actually float. It is a simpler and stranger question. Why does everyone remember this? Not just the people who inherited the Hebrew Bible, not just the communities shaped by the Jewish and Christian and Islamic traditions that carry this story as sacred text. Everyone. Flood stories appear across the ancient world with a consistency that cannot be explained by coincidence and cannot be fully explained by borrowing. Mesopotamia has them. Ancient India has them. The indigenous traditions of the Americas have them. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries and the complete absence of any documented contact with each other carry versions of the same essential shape. A great flood. A warning given to one person or one family. A vessel of survival. Animals saved. The water receding. A world beginning again from almost nothing. The specific details vary. The names change. The theology differs radically from tradition to tradition. But the shape of the story, the essential movement of catastrophe and survival and new beginning, appears in human memory with a frequency that demands to be taken seriously as a question, even when it does not demand a single answer. Why do we all remember this? That question will not be resolved here. No one has resolved it. But we are going to spend time with the version of this story that existed in the ancient world closest to Genesis. Because that version illuminates something about what Genesis is doing that nothing else illuminates quite as clearly. And what Genesis is doing is not what you would expect if you came to it without knowing it had predecessors. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest pieces of literature ever discovered. The tablets containing it were found in the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, excavated in the 19th century. The story is Mesopotamian. From the same region of the ancient world that produced the cultural context Genesis itself emerged from. In the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, there is a flood story. The survivor is a man named Utnapishtim, and when you read his story alongside Noah's, something remarkable happens. The similarities are close enough to make the connection between the two traditions undeniable, but the differences are where everything that matters lives. Here is the situation Utnapishtim finds himself in. The great gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon have gathered in council and decided to destroy humanity with a flood. The decision is made by committee. Different gods have different opinions. The god Enlil, the chief deity, wants the destruction. The god Ea, god of wisdom and fresh water, does not. The decree goes forward over Ea's objection. Ea cannot openly defy the council decision, but he finds a workaround. He goes to the wall of Utnapishtim's reed house and speaks to the wall, not technically to Utnapishtim himself, and tells the wall what is coming and what to build. Utnapishtim, standing on the other side, hears everything. It is a legal fiction, a technicality. Ea has technically not violated the council decree by warning a human directly. He has merely spoken to a wall. This is how Utnapishtim finds out the flood is coming. Through divine politics, through a god who likes him enough to exploit a loophole on his behalf. Now hold that story next to what Genesis gives us. There is no council. There are no competing divine factions. There is no loophole being exploited. There is one God who looks at the world with grief and makes a decision, and who then speaks directly to Noah. Not through an intermediary, not to a wall, not through the mechanics of divine politics. God speaks to Noah. He tells Noah not just what is coming, but why. He explains the reasoning. He makes a covenant before the building begins. He treats Noah as someone worth explaining things to. In the Gilgamesh version, Utnapishtim survives because a god who likes him is clever enough to find a way around the rules. He is the beneficiary of divine favoritism operating within a system of competing powers. In Genesis, Noah is found because of what he is, because he walks with God, because he is Tamim, undivided, in a world of divisions, because when God looks at the world with grief, Noah is the one person whose life is oriented in the same direction as the one doing the looking. That is a completely different kind of relationship between a human being and the divine, and it produces a completely different kind of story. But the differences go further than the relationship. After the flood in the Gilgamesh epic, Utnapishtim is rewarded with immortality. He and his wife are granted eternal life and placed at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, permanently separated from the rest of humanity. He becomes a monument to the event, preserved at the moment of his greatest significance, outside of normal human time. He is taken out of history. He becomes the man the flood made, frozen at the moment that defines him, permanently inaccessible to the ordinary world. When the hero Gilgamesh eventually finds him, seeking the secret of eternal life, what Utnapishtim has to offer is distance. He is at the end of the world. He is unreachable by ordinary means. The journey to find him is the journey to the absolute limit of human possibility. His survival separated him from humanity forever. Now look at what happens to Noah. No immortality, no removal to the edge of the world, no monument, no memorial, no special status that permanently separates him from the rest of human life. God blesses him. God makes a covenant with him. And then Noah plants a vineyard. He is given back to the world, returned to the ordinary, to the soil, to the slow, patient work of growing things and tending land and living out the rest of his years in the same embodied, temporal, mortal human life that everyone around him lives. He is not taken out of history. He is put back into it. And this, more than any other single detail, tells us what kind of God Genesis is describing and what kind of survival Genesis is imagining. Not a survival that removes the saved person from the difficulties and limitations of human life. Not a reward that consists of being permanently exempted from the conditions that make human life hard. A survival that puts you back in. That says you are going to live through this, and then you are going to go on living. And the living will be complicated, and the soil will be real, and the wine will be strong, and the family will be imperfect, and the years will pass one after another with all their weight. And you will be in all of it. Now there is one more ancient flood story worth examining before we leave this territory, because it illuminates something specific about the deep roots of the tradition. The Atrahasis epic is older than the Gilgamesh flood story, and scholars believe it is one of the sources the Gilgamesh author was drawing on. In the Atrahasis epic, the reason the gods decide to send a flood is not moral corruption. It is noise. The human population has grown so large and so loud that the gods cannot sleep. Enlil is being kept awake by the noise of humanity. He tries other solutions first. Plague, drought, famine. But humanity keeps recovering and keeps multiplying and keeps making noise. The flood is the last resort of a god who is simply tired of being disturbed. In the Atrahasis epic, human beings are destroyed not because they are wicked, but because they are inconvenient. Place that next to Genesis chapter 6. Verse 6. The Lord was grieved to his heart. The God of Genesis is not inconvenienced by humanity. He is grieved by them. The difference between those two responses is the difference between a God who created human beings as a labor-saving device and a God who created human beings as something worth loving. Inconvenience produces a desire for the noise to stop. Grief produces something much more complicated. Grief does not want the beloved to simply disappear. Grief wants something to be different than it has become, while knowing that wanting alone cannot make it so. These ancient stories are not relics. They are the record of humanity wrestling with the same enormous questions across different cultures and different centuries. Why is the world as it is? Why does the divine tolerate what it tolerates? And why does it sometimes not? What is the relationship between human wrongdoing and cosmic consequence? Every culture that has a flood story is asking those questions in the language and imagery available to it. And Genesis is answering them differently from all the others. Not with a loophole, not with divine politics, not with inconvenience and the desire for quiet, but with a God who looks at the world he made and loves it enough to grieve what it has become, and who finds in the middle of that grief one man who is still going in the right direction, and decides that one man is enough to begin with. Here is what that comparison ultimately reveals. And it is perhaps the most important thing the ancient flood traditions show us when placed alongside Genesis. In every other version of the story, the flood is essentially an interruption, something that happens to the world from outside, imposed by powers with their own agendas, and then finished. The world before and the world after are the same world with different scenery. The flood changes the landscape but not the story. In Genesis, the flood is not an interruption. It is a revelation. It reveals something about the nature of God and the nature of human beings that was always true but is now undeniable. It does not leave the world the same. It leaves the world with a covenant it did not have before. A promise sealed not with a signature but with the image of a weapon being laid down. The flood in Genesis is not the end of a problem. It is the beginning of a question. The question that every person who reads this story eventually arrives at. Whether they come to it through faith or through curiosity or through the simple human recognition that the same story keeps appearing in every corner of the world that humans have ever inhabited. If the world had to be washed clean and begin again, why does the world after the washing look so much like the world before it? Why do the same patterns reassert themselves? Why does the same human tendency resurface? Why is Babel built after the covenant has been signed and the rainbow placed in the sky? Why does the water not fix what needed fixing? We are not ready to answer that question yet. The answer lives in the parts of the story that most tellings never reach. It lives in the vineyard and the tent and the morning after. It lives in what Noah carries through the water that the water cannot touch. But we can see the shape of the question now, because the Mesopotamian versions never raise it. Only Genesis has a God who grieves instead of just being annoyed. Only Genesis has a man who is found instead of just being lucky. Only Genesis has a covenant that does not exempt the survivors from being human. And only Genesis, therefore, has to answer for what happens when the human beings who survive the flood turn out to still be human. That answer is coming. But first, we have to watch the flood happen. And before the flood happens, we have to watch one man do something that no one around him can fully understand, for reasons he cannot fully explain, for a length of time that would break most people, in full view of a world that has every reason to think he has lost his mind. We have to watch Noah build. Chapter 5. The Blueprint. There is a kind of faith that is easy to have, the kind that costs nothing, that fits comfortably inside a normal life, that does not require you to do anything visible or strange or difficult to explain to the people who know you, the kind that lives in the interior, held privately, expressed occasionally in the right settings, never requiring you to stake your reputation or your relationships or your daily routine on something that cannot be verified by anyone standing outside your experience of it. That is not the kind of faith Noah had. Noah had the kind of faith that required him to pick up an axe and keep swinging it in public for a very long time, in response to something that no one around him could see coming, that he could not prove was coming, and that had no precedent in the experience of anyone alive. That is a different thing entirely, and it deserves more time than the story usually gives it. Genesis chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. These instructions are specific in a way that matters. God does not say, build something large enough to hold a lot of animals and figure out the details yourself. He gives dimensions. He specifies materials. He describes the architecture. 300 cubits, 50 cubits, 30 cubits, 3 decks, a roof finished to 1 cubit above, a door in the side. The cubit is an ancient unit of measurement based on the length of the forearm from elbow to fingertip, typically between 17 and 21 inches depending on the standard being used, using the common Hebrew cubit of approximately 18 inches. The ark works out to roughly 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. To put that in terms that mean something, 450 feet is longer than a modern American football field, including both end zones. The ark would have had a total deck area of approximately 95,000 square feet across its 3 levels. Its gross tonnage would have placed it among the larger wooden vessels of any era until the 19th century. This was not a boat. This was a structure, and it was being built by one family, with hand tools, in the ancient world, in response to an event that had no historical precedent and no physical evidence of its approach. Now step back from the numbers and think about what the construction would have looked like from the outside. Someone in the community where Noah lived, going about their ordinary day, would have watched this project develop over time. In the beginning, perhaps, the felling of trees, the clearing of land, the beginning of what might be any large construction project. Then the shape begins to emerge, and the shape is wrong. Too wide for a building, too long. The proportions are not those of any structure that serves a recognizable purpose. No windows in the conventional sense. Only a small opening near the roof for light and air. No hearth. No rooms arranged in the pattern of habitation. No doorway positioned for the ordinary flow of daily life. A single door, in the side, large enough to move large things through. The people who pass it every day begin to understand that this is not a house, not a barn, not a storehouse. It is something that has no name in their vocabulary because nothing like it has ever been built before. And the man building it, when asked what it is for, has an answer that sits somewhere between absurd and disturbing. Water, he would have said. It is for water. What water? The water that is coming. There is no lake nearby large enough. There is no river that floods to anywhere near this scale. No clouds on the horizon. No shift in the seasons. No warning sign that the people around Noah could point to as evidence that what he is saying has any connection to observable reality. There is only a man with an axe and a blueprint and a conviction that cannot be explained to anyone who did not receive it the same way he received it. Now think about what that social reality does to a person over time. It is not the first year that tests you. In the first year, conviction is fresh. The memory of what you heard is vivid. The decision is recent and still feels like it belongs to the present tense. You are building. Things are happening. Progress is visible in the timber and the pitch and the growing shape of something that has never existed before. It is not even the 5th year, or the 10th. It is the years after the point where you have told everyone who is going to hear you, and no one has believed you, and the structure is still going up, and the skies are still clear, and the people who used to ask questions have stopped asking because they have already decided what they think. Those are the years that reveal what a person is actually made of. Because in those years, the only thing that keeps you swinging the axe is something that lives entirely on the inside. No external confirmation. No community of people who share the conviction. No prophet standing beside you saying yes. You heard correctly. Keep going. Just the memory of what was spoken to you, held against the daily evidence of a world that shows no signs of agreeing with it. Most people cannot sustain that, not because they are weak, but because the human mind is not built to maintain conviction indefinitely against a persistent absence of external confirmation. We are social creatures. We calibrate our sense of reality against the reality that the people around us share. When everyone around you is living as though the thing you believe is not true, the belief begins to erode. Not all at once, grain by grain. In the 1,000 small moments when the evidence of your senses says one thing and the voice you heard once says another. Noah kept building. Genesis chapter 6. Verse 22. Noah did all that God commanded him. That is the entire record of the construction. One sentence. No duration specified in this verse. No account of the difficulties encountered. No description of the doubts or the mornings when the sky was perfectly clear and the idea of a flood seemed like the most implausible thing in the world. One sentence covering what tradition imagines as a period of enormous labor and enormous endurance. Noah did all that God commanded him. The compression is itself a statement. The text is not interested in the drama of the construction. It is interested in the fact of the completion. What mattered was not the experience of building. What mattered was that when the time came, the thing was built. But there is something else in the building that we should not overlook. Something the text describes by implication rather than by statement. The ark was not built in secret. If you are constructing a 450-foot wooden structure, you are constructing it in full view of everyone within sight of it. The noise of the work, the smell of the pitch, the sheer physical presence of something that size growing in the landscape, is not concealable. Noah built in public, which means every day of construction was a public act of conviction. Every beam raised was a visible statement that this man believed something that no one around him believed. Every day the ark grew larger was a day that Noah's commitment became more difficult to walk back from, more visible, more committed in the eyes of everyone watching. There is a point in any long act of public conviction past which turning back is more costly than continuing, past which the statement you have made with your actions is large enough that reversing it would be its own kind of destruction. Noah crossed that point early and kept going. He was not a quiet, private believer who kept his faith where it could not be challenged. He was a man whose belief was physically present in the landscape, growing larger every day. And here is what that cost him in the currency that matters most in any human community. It cost him the ordinary comfort of being believed by the people around him. Not just disliked, not just opposed, something harder than either of those. In some ways, He was probably simply not taken seriously anymore. The man building the enormous boat. The man who thinks the water is coming. You know the one. His family exchanges glances when he looks away. His neighbors have long since stopped arguing and settled into the comfortable dismissal that is worse than argument because it requires no engagement. He is just Noah, building his boat. And then Genesis chapter 7 opens, and everything changes. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." The voice comes back, "Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." 7 days. After all the years of building, after all the accumulation of effort and endurance and public conviction, the notice is 7 days. Not a month, not a year. 7 days. There is something almost tender about that specificity. The way it transforms the abstract future threat into a concrete and immediate reality. The water is not coming eventually. It is coming in 7 days. The construction is complete. The moment it was always aimed at has arrived. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. The same sentence, different moment. The first time it described the completion of the building. This time it describes the gathering and the loading. The movement of every creature that breathes into the one place prepared for it. Noah is 600 years old when the waters of the flood came upon the earth. 600 years of life. 600 years of watching the world become what it became. 600 years of walking with God in a direction the world around him was not going. And now he is standing at the door of the thing he built. The last thing Genesis records before the door closes is one of the most intimate images in the entire story. Genesis chapter 7, verse 16. "And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him. And the Lord shut him in." The Lord shut him in. Not Noah, not his sons, not the mechanism of some large wooden bar dropping into place. The Lord shut him in. There are many ways to read that detail. It can be read as divine protection, the sealing of the righteous remnant against what is coming. It can be read as the finality of a moment that Noah himself could not have brought himself to execute. The closing of a door on a world that contained people he had known and lived among. But here is what I keep returning to when I read those 4 words. The God who found Noah in the grief of looking at a ruined world, who spoke to him and gave him a blueprint and made a covenant before the work began, who waited through all the years of building with a patience that the text does not explain, is the one who closes the door at the end. Not a servant, not a mechanism. The Lord shut him in, and the rain began. Chapter 6. The people outside the ark. There is something the story of Noah asks of us that we almost never give it. Not belief. Not theological agreement. Not the suspension of scientific skepticism or the acceptance of miracle as a category of event. It asks us to stop. To stop moving through the narrative toward the rainbow at the end. And to stand for a moment in the place the story never describes, with the people the story never names, and feel the weight of what is actually being described. When Genesis says, "The waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth," the text gives us one sentence for what happens to the world outside the ark. Genesis chapter 7, verse 21. "And all flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind." All mankind. 2 words in the English. And then the narrative moves on to water levels and duration and the calculations of depth, because the story has somewhere to go, and the someone it needs to follow is inside the ark. And the people outside the ark are not going anywhere. They have no names in this story. That is the first thing to hold. Every person who dies in the flood is nameless in Genesis. The men building cities and making music and raising children and fighting and loving and going about the ordinary business of being alive in the world before the water came. None of them are given a name. None of them are given a face. None of them are given a final scene. They are referred to collectively as all mankind, and the narrative moves on. This is not carelessness. It is a choice. And the choice is doing something. Remember what Genesis told us about the world before the flood. All flesh had corrupted their way. Every intention of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. The Hamas that had filled the earth was systemic, woven into the fabric of how the world operated. Not the property of a few especially wicked individuals, but the ambient condition of an entire civilization. A civilization of people. People who, if we could stand next to them on any ordinary day of their ordinary lives, would not look like villains, would look like people, doing what people do, working and eating and sleeping and arguing and making peace and falling in love and mourning their dead and hoping for their children. The thing that makes the flood the hardest part of the Noah story to sit with honestly is not the scale of the destruction. It is the ordinariness of the people being destroyed. The world that God looked at with grief was not a world of monsters. It was a world of ordinary people who had, collectively and over generations, moved so far from what they were made for that the movement had become irreversible. Each individual person living inside that movement was not necessarily extraordinary in their wickedness. They were participants in a system that had normalized the abnormal so thoroughly that most of them could not see it anymore. They thought this was just how the world worked. This is what makes the flood more terrible, not less. It would be easier if the people outside the ark were clearly and obviously evil. If every face we imagine outside that wooden wall belonged to someone committing a visible atrocity, then the judgment would be clean. The math would be simple. But the world does not produce people who are entirely and transparently wicked. It produces people who are embedded in systems of corruption and who participate in those systems the way people always participate in the systems they are born into, without full awareness of what they are participating in, doing what the world around them has taught them to do, and calling it normal. The people outside the ark were normal. That is the most devastating thing about them. Now think about what Noah heard from inside the ark. Genesis does not tell us. It does not describe the sounds that penetrated the gopher wood as the water rose. It does not record what Noah's family heard or what they said to each other in those first hours and days. It gives us silence on the inside and the arithmetic of rising water on the outside and nothing in between. But we are not required to pretend we cannot imagine. Water rising over a populated world is not a silent event. Whatever Noah heard through those walls in the early hours, it was not nothing. And here is the thing the text has established carefully, and that this moment puts under the greatest pressure. Noah walked with God. He walked with the God who was grieved to his heart by the destruction of the world he had made and loved, the God who felt it. And if walking with God means anything, if it means the kind of side-by-side movement that the phrase implies, then Noah was not entirely separated from what God felt about what was happening outside. He was not celebrating. We need to establish that clearly, because the way this story is sometimes told implies that Noah and his family were on the right side of a clean moral division, safely preserved while the wicked got what they deserved, and everyone in the ark could feel satisfied about the outcome. That reading requires ignoring everything the text has established about who God is and how God feels about this. The God who sent the flood was grieved before he sent it. There is no indication in the text that the sending of it resolved the grief. The God who will say after the water recedes that the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth and then decide never to destroy the world this way again, was holding something complex, something that cannot be reduced to the satisfaction of justice being done. And Noah, who walked with this God, was inside a boat. listening to the world outside, it disappear. There is a tradition in certain streams of Jewish interpretation that imagines Noah weeping during the flood, that imagines him not as a triumphant survivor but as a man in mourning, preserved alive in the middle of the greatest loss in human history, unable to fully separate his survival from his grief. The text does not say this, but the text does not contradict it. And the text has given us enough about Noah and enough about God to make the weeping feel more honest than the alternative. Now we have to say something about what is not in the story and what the absence of it means. There is no record of Noah warning anyone. We are so accustomed to the figure of the prophet crying out in the wilderness, urging people to repent, that it feels like it should be there. Later tradition, including references in the letters of Peter in the New Testament, describes Noah as a preacher of righteousness, a herald of what was coming. And that tradition may reflect something real. But Genesis itself does not record a single word that Noah spoke to anyone other than in response to God. Not one sermon, not one warning, not one recorded attempt to bring someone else into the ark. This silence is strange, and it has been noticed by readers for a very long time. One reading of the silence is simply that the warnings happened and Genesis did not record them. Another reading is that Noah's obedience was of a particular kind that expressed itself in building rather than in speaking. That the ark itself was the warning, and the warning was refused not by argument, but by the daily choice to go on living, as though the thing being warned against was not coming. A third reading is the one I find most honest about what the text is actually showing us. Noah's silence is part of the pattern of the man. He does not argue with God. He does not negotiate or intercede on behalf of the world. He builds what he is told to build, and gathers what he is told to gather, and enters the ark when he is told to enter. There is no Abraham in this story. There is no moment where Noah stands before God and argues, as Abraham will argue before the destruction of Sodom, asking whether the righteous will be swept away with the wicked, pushing back, insisting that justice requires discrimination. Noah does not argue. He builds, and he enters, and the door closes, and the water rises, and the people outside the ark, nameless and uncounted and as ordinary as people have always been, are lost in 2 words: all mankind. Now we have to ask the question that this chapter exists to ask. The question the text raises by its silence and its compression and its refusal to give names and faces to the people who die. What does it mean that God did this? Anyone who gives you an easy answer to that question is not taking it seriously. The God of Genesis is the God who grieved before the flood, the God who found Noah in the middle of the grief, the God who made a covenant before the construction began, the God who will, after the water recedes, make a promise that contains within it the acknowledgement that the human heart is still what it always was. This is not a God who destroyed the world because he did not care about it. This is a God who destroyed the world precisely because he cared about it. Because the Hamas that had filled it was incompatible with what the world was supposed to be. Because the corruption had gone past the point where anything short of ending and beginning again could address it. Whether that justification satisfies you is a question you will have to answer for yourself. The text does not answer it for you. It gives you God's grief and God's decision and the 2 words all mankind and moves on to the water levels and leaves you standing in the space between those things. What the text will not let you do is pretend the people outside the ark were not people. They were. They had names that Genesis did not record. They had faces that no one has ever been given. They had ordinary days that ended in a way no ordinary day is supposed to end. And the man inside the ark, the man who walked with God, was sealed in there, knowing that the God he walked with knew every one of those names, even if the text did not write them down. This is not a comfortable place to stand. It is not supposed to be. The flood is not comfortable. The people outside the ark are not a backdrop. They are the reason the story is as heavy as it is. The reason the rainbow at the end carries the weight it carries. The reason the covenant matters as much as it matters. You cannot understand why God swearing never to do this again is significant unless you have stood long enough with what it would mean if he did. The door is closed. The water is rising. And the man who built the thing that is rising above it has not said a word that Genesis records. He is in the dark, with the weight of the world outside, pressing against the wood, and the particular silence that comes when everything you have known goes quiet on the other side of a wall you did not build and cannot open. That silence is what the flood sounds like from the inside. Chapter 7. The door that closed from outside. There is a detail in Genesis chapter 7 that most people read past without stopping. It is 4 words in English. And the Lord shut him in. 4 words, placed at the end of verse 16. After the listing of the animals and the confirmation that Noah had done as God commanded, almost as a logistical note about the final step of the boarding process. The Lord shut him in. Not Noah, not his sons, not the natural consequence of everyone being inside and the practical necessity of closing a door. The text is specific about the agent of the action. God closed the door. Stop there before you move on. Because this detail, 4 words long, changes the meaning of everything that surrounds it. Why does it matter who closes the door? Because the door of the ark is not just a physical barrier between inside and outside. In the world of Genesis chapter 7, the door of the ark is the line between the world that will survive and the world that will not. It is the most consequential threshold in human history up to that point. And the question of who closes it is the question of who bears the responsibility for what the closing means. If Noah closes the door, then Noah makes the final determination. Noah decides that the moment has come, that everyone who is going to be in is in, that the time for any remaining opportunity has passed. Noah bears the weight of that decision, but that is not what the text says. The text says God closed it. God made the final determination. The weight of the closing, whatever that weight is, rests not on the shoulders of the man inside, but on the God who sealed the entrance from outside. This is a mercy to Noah that the story does not announce as a mercy. Because whatever Noah felt in those hours before the rain became the flood, whatever he heard or imagined or grieved in the sealed darkness of the ark's interior, he did not close the door himself. He did not lift the bar or drop the latch or make the physical act that would separate him forever from the world outside. He was sealed inside by something beyond himself. The distinction matters because of what it preserves in Noah. The man who walks with God does not have to become the executioner of the world. He does not have to make the decision that ends it. He is preserved inside the preservation, not appointed as the agent of the punishment. The judgment is God's action, executed by God, sealed by God. Noah is kept. He is not the instrument of what happens to those who are not. Now stay with the physical reality of what those 4 words describe. The ark has been built. The animals have been loaded in the organized and extraordinary process that Genesis chapter 7 describes. The clean animals in their groups of 7. The unclean animals in their pairs. The birds of the heavens in their pairs. A process that must have taken days. A visible and unmistakable mobilization of the living world into the one structure built to receive it. And then Noah and his household enter. 8 people, the last human beings to board. And then the door closes. From the outside, now think about what comes immediately after. Genesis chapter 7, verse 10. And after 7 days the waters of the flood came upon the earth. 7 days. The door is already closed. The animals are already inside. Noah and his family are already sealed in the ark. And then Genesis tells us that 7 days passed before the floodwaters came. 7 days of waiting. In the dark, in the smell of animals and pitch and wood, in the complete sealing of everything familiar behind a door that someone else closed. 7 days in which the world outside was still there, still going about whatever it went about in those 7 days. still breathing and living, perhaps entirely unaware that the countdown had already begun. This detail disappears quickly in most tellings of the Noah story. It tends to get compressed or omitted entirely, but it deserves to be held. 7 days. What do you do for 7 days inside a sealed ark? With the animals and the family and the darkness and the knowledge of what is coming, while outside the world goes on. The text gives us nothing about those 7 days. No record of conversation. No description of how the 8 people inside occupied their time or managed their fear or talked to each other. The 7 days are a silence that Genesis creates and then moves past without filling. But silences in Genesis are not absences. They are spaces the text creates for the reader to inhabit. So inhabit it for a moment. You are inside a structure that you built over years in response to something you heard. The door is closed. Not by you, by the one whose voice started this. You are in the dark. And outside the dark, the world you have lived in your entire life is still there. And in 7 days it will not be. What do you do with that week? There is a tradition in certain readings of Genesis that those 7 days correspond to the traditional period of mourning that Jewish practice observes after the death of a loved one. 7 days. Under this reading, the waiting period before the flood was itself a period of grief. A space in which the weight of what was about to be lost was acknowledged before it was lost. Not a period of final preparation, a period of mourning. God mourning the world he was about to release. For 7 days, before a drop of rain, hold that image alongside Noah sealed in the ark. The man who walked with God, waiting in the dark alongside the God who grieves. For the moment that both of them know is coming. Then Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. 2 sources. The fountains of the great deep, and the windows of the heavens. In the cosmology of Genesis, the world is held in equilibrium between 2 bodies of water. The waters above, held back by the vault of the sky, and the waters below, contained beneath the earth. Creation in Genesis chapter 1 was partly the act of establishing that equilibrium, separating the waters above from the waters below, holding them in their places so that dry land could exist between them. The flood is that equilibrium breaking. Both containments fail simultaneously. The decument bursts open from below. The sky opens from above. The world is caught between 2 directions of water, with nowhere to go. This is not a rainstorm. This is the architecture of creation failing. The structures God put in place to make a livable world possible are letting go. And what pours in from both directions is the chaos that was always held at bay by those structures. The flood is Genesis chapter 1 being run backwards, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 in Hebrew carries the weight of a long and defining period. It appears throughout the Hebrew Bible at moments of transformation and trial. Moses on the mountain for 40 days. Israel wandering for 40 years. The number is not always meant literally. It is the number of enough time. Enough time for something to complete itself. Enough time for a transformation to be thorough. 40 days of rain on a world that cannot absorb it. Then Genesis gives us the verse that tells us what the water did. Chapter 7, verse 20. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. The mountains are covered, not the valleys, not the plains, the mountains. Every high place that a person might have climbed to escape, every elevation that survival instinct would have directed terrified people toward, is under water. There is no high ground. There is nowhere to go. And the ark, built by one man over years in response to something no one around him believed was coming, floats above the mountains. Now we have to address the question that every serious reader of this story eventually asks. The question that modern geological knowledge makes unavoidable. Was this a global flood? The honest answer is that the text of Genesis uses language that describes totality. The waters prevailed above all the high mountains under the whole heaven. All flesh died. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. The language is total. The science, as currently understood, does not support a single global flood event that covered every mountain on Earth within recorded human history. The evidence of geology and the fossil record does not present a uniform layer of flood sediment across the entire planet corresponding to a few thousand years ago. But something else is also true. The ancient Near East, the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, where the cultural ancestors of Genesis lived, is a floodplain that has experienced catastrophic floods throughout human history. For the people of the ancient world, a flood that destroyed everything they knew was a flood that destroyed everything. The language of totality is the language of overwhelming, world-ending experience described from the inside of that experience. This is not an argument for or against any particular reading of the text. It is a reminder that the people who first told and preserved and wrote down this story were not writing a geological survey. They were preserving the memory of something their tradition understood as the most significant event in human history. Described in the language available to them, what that something was, in its full physical reality, remains genuinely open. What is not open is what the story understands it to mean. The world that was created good, that had corrupted its way, that God looked at with grief, is underwater, and 8 people and every breathing creature are floating above it in the dark. The door is still closed from the outside, and the man inside who built the thing they are floating in has not said a word. He is waiting, not with the impatience of someone who wants it to be over, not with the satisfaction of someone who has been proven right, not with the quiet triumph of a survivor who was on the correct side of a division. He is waiting with the quality of waiting that belongs to a person who has been sealed inside something by a hand other than their own, and who understands that the unsealing will also happen in its own time, by the same hand, when the time that is not his time has run its course. God closed the door. God will open it. In between, there is only the water, and the dark, and the particular silence of 8 people floating above the end of the world they came from. In the dark, unable to see out, held in place by the pitch on the outside of the walls and the hand that shut the door. Chapter 8. Creation Reversed. There is a way of reading the flood story that keeps it at a safe distance. The safe distance version goes like this. It rained for 40 days. The water rose. The ark floated. The water receded. Noah came out. The safe distance version processes the flood as a sequence of events, notes the duration, acknowledges the scale, and moves on to the rainbow. That version misses what Genesis is actually doing. Because Genesis is not telling a weather story. Genesis is telling a creation story. And to understand what the flood means at the level this text intends, you have to read it against the background of what came before it. The 7 days of Genesis, chapter 1. The careful and deliberate ordering of a world out of formlessness. The establishment of every boundary and separation and category that makes a livable world possible. You have to understand what was built before you can understand what is being undone. Genesis, chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. 2 things are present before God begins to work: darkness and water. The Hebrew word for the deep in that verse is tehom, the primal waters, the unformed chaos that underlies creation, the state of things before God begins to separate and order and call forth. Tehom is not evil in Genesis. It is simply the unformed, the not yet ordered, the potential that has not yet been shaped into anything. And then God begins. He separates light from darkness. He separates the waters above from the waters below by placing a vault between them. He gathers the waters below into seas and lets the dry land appear. He fills the dry land with vegetation, and the seas with creatures, and the sky with birds, and the land with animals, and finally with human beings made in his image, given the breath of life, placed in a garden. Every act of creation in Genesis chapter 1 is an act of separation, of establishing distinctions that did not exist before, of pulling order out of chaos by the consistent application of the divine word. Let there be, and there was, and it was good. The world of Genesis chapter 1 is a world of maintained distinctions. Light distinct from darkness, sky distinct from water, land distinct from sea, living from non-living. The entire livable world depends on these distinctions being held. Now read Genesis chapter 7 with all of that in your memory. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The great deep, Tehom, the primal chaos of Genesis chapter 1 that God separated and contained when he made the world, is breaking through its containment. The waters above, held back by the vault of the sky since the second day of creation, are pouring through. Both containments established in Genesis chapter 1 are failing at the same moment. This is not a flood. This is creation being reversed. The distinctions that God established to make a livable world possible are collapsing. The boundary between sky water and earth water dissolves. The boundary between sea and dry land dissolves. The world is returning to what it was before God began. And everything that lives in the ordered world, everything whose breath is possible only because the world is structured the way God structured it, loses its breath as the structure fails. This is why Genesis uses the phrase, "in whose nostrils was the breath of life," when it describes what dies in the flood. The breath of life is the specific thing God breathed into the first human being in Genesis chapter 2. When the world's order fails, the breath fails with it. Creation reversed means life reversed. Now look at the literary structure of the flood narrative itself, because this is where the discovery gets interesting. Scholars who read the Hebrew have long noticed that the flood narrative in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 has a particular shape. It is what literary scholars call a chiastic structure, a pattern where the elements of the first half are mirrored in reverse order in the second half, with a central point at the turning. Think of it like a mountain. You climb up one side, reach the peak, and descend the other side along a mirrored path. In the flood narrative, the elements on the way up are these: the corruption of the world, the command to build, the gathering of the animals, the entry into the ark, the closing of the door, the rising of the water, the death of all flesh, and then the peak. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah. 2 words in Hebrew. Vayizkor Elohim, and God remembered. This is the center of the entire flood narrative, the highest point of the chiastic mountain, the pivot on which the whole story turns. Not the rainbow, not the covenant, not the sending of the dove. Those come on the way down the other side. The center, the thing that changes the direction of everything, is this: God remembered. And then the descent begins. After God remembers, the water starts to decrease. The fountains of the deep are closed. The windows of heaven are restrained. The rain stops. A wind blows over the earth and the waters recede. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. The tops of the mountains appear. The dove finds a resting place. Dry ground. Exit. Covenant. Rainbow. The structure is exact. The going up mirrors the coming down. The death of all flesh on the way up is answered by the covenant with all flesh on the way down. The gathering of animals into the ark is answered by the sending out of animals from the ark. The rising waters are answered by the receding waters. And at the center of it all, holding the whole structure together, enabling the reversal from destruction to restoration, is not a human action, not Noah doing something courageous, not the rain stopping on its own schedule. God remembered. Now what does it mean that God remembers? In the Hebrew Bible, divine remembrance is not the recovery of forgotten information. God does not remember Noah the way you remember where you left your keys. God is not forgetful. To remember in the Hebrew sense is to act in accordance with a prior commitment, to turn your attention towards someone in a way that produces action on their behalf. When God remembers Noah, the covenant announced before the flood began, but I will establish my covenant with you of Genesis chapter 6, is now being put into motion. The remembering is the covenant becoming active. And notice what comes immediately after. God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained. God acts. The reversal of the reversal begins. What was undone in the opening of Tehom is now being restored. The waters are being gathered and contained again. The boundaries that creation depends on are being reestablished. Creation is being recreated, not exactly as it was. The world that emerges from the flood is not the world that went into it. The covenant that will be signed over it changes its relationship to the divine. Something has been lost, and something has been given in return. Though the accounting of that exchange will take the rest of Genesis to begin to work out, but the basic structure follows the same pattern as Genesis chapter 1. The reversal is being reversed. Creation is happening again. Now come the birds. Genesis chapter 8, verses 6 through 12. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him, to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. 2 birds, 2 very different responses to the same world. The raven goes and does not come back. It finds what it needs out there. In the world, still more water than land. Still in the process of transition. The raven is a scavenger. It can sustain itself on what the receding flood has left behind. It does not need dry ground or living plants, or the restored order of a world where things grow the way they are supposed to grow. The raven does not come back. And there is something almost painful about that. Noah sent the raven looking for signs of a returning world. And the raven found ways to survive in the wreckage and moved on. Its survival is not good news for Noah. It is not the sign he was looking for. So he sends the dove. The dove needs something different. It requires a perch. Somewhere to land that is not water. Somewhere the ground has returned and can offer what a dove needs. The dove cannot sustain itself on chaos. It needs the restored order. It needs dry land. The dove comes back the first time with nothing. Genesis chapter 8, verse 9. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark. He put out his hand and took her, and brought her into the ark with him. He put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. This is one of the most tender images in the entire flood narrative. The man who has not spoken a recorded word, who has built and loaded and waited and floated in silence, reaching through the window of the ark to take a small bird back into safety, his hand going out to receive it. 7 days later he sends the dove again. And the dove came back to him in the evening. And behold, in her beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf, a single leaf, not dry ground, not a landscape, not a bird's eye view of a restored world. A single leaf, freshly plucked, carried back in the beak of a small bird to the window of an ark floating above, a world still mostly covered by receding water. And Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. A leaf told him, not a proclamation, not a vision, not the voice of God announcing that the time had come. A dove with a leaf in its beak, returning at evening to the window where Noah's hand was waiting. That is how Noah found out the world was coming back. He waited another 7 days and sent the dove again. And the dove did not come back. She found what she needed. Dry ground. A resting place. a world that had come back enough to support the life of a creature that needs to perch. And she stayed. But even after the dove does not return, Noah waits. Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. He looks out. The ground is dry. And then he waits again. Genesis chapter 8, verse 15. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, Go out from the ark, you and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Noah does not exit when he sees the ground is dry. He does not decide on his own authority that the time has come. He waits for the word. The same voice that told him to enter tells him to go out. He came in when God told him to come in. He goes out when God tells him to go out. In between, he waits. He sends birds and receives them and waits again. He watches the ground dry and waits again. This waiting is not passivity. It is the same quality of orientation that made him tamim, undivided, walking in the direction of the one he walked with. He does not assume that his own perception of readiness is the same as the divine determination of readiness. He waits for the word. And when the word comes, he goes. Genesis chapter 8, verse 18. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark, by families. The animals do not stream out in an undifferentiated mass. They go out by families, in their kinds, in the organized categories that God established in Genesis chapter 1 when he made the living things and commanded them to reproduce after their kind. Creation is being reorganized according to its original structure. The world is not yet what it was. It is wet and empty and unmarked by the civilization that was washed from it. No cities, no music, no roads, no accumulated human achievement. Just ground and sky and water receding, and 8 people standing in the open air for the first time in more than a year. And every creature that breathes, organized by family, stepping out of the one structure that held them through the undoing of the world. This is the image Genesis gives us at the end of the flood. Not triumph, not the clean satisfaction of justice completed and order restored. Just people and animals on empty ground, in the light of a cleared sky. The world that was reversed has been reversed again. But the people standing on it are the same people who went into the ark, with everything that means, with everything that will follow from it. The reversal of creation is complete. The reversal of the human heart has not begun. That is the story that starts now. Chapter 9, the first step. There is a moment that every survivor knows. Not the moment of rescue, not the moment when the danger passes, or the water recedes, or the door finally opens and the light comes in. Those moments have their own weight. But they are not the moment I mean. The moment I mean is the one that comes after. When you step out into the world that remains. And the world that remains is not the world you left. And the person stepping out is not entirely the person who went in. And the question that no one prepared you for is standing there in the open air waiting. What do you do now? Noah has been inside the ark for more than a year by the reckoning of the text. 370 days sealed inside a structure he built, floating above a world dissolving beneath him, surrounded by the sounds and smells and pressing physical reality of every creature that draws breath, with 7 other people and no record of what any of them said to each other during all of that time. And then God speaks, and the door opens, and Noah steps out. Onto what? Genesis chapter 8, verse 13 gives us the image. The waters were dried from off the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. The face of the ground was dry. Not lush, not green and growing and welcoming. Dry. The word in Hebrew is hareva, and it carries the sense of a surface from which water has withdrawn, that is solid enough to stand on, that is no longer submerged. But it does not mean restored. It does not mean abundant. It means the water is gone. Noah is standing on ground that the flood has scoured, ground that is empty in every direction, with no sign of the world that used to occupy it, no horizon that contains a city or a building or a road or a tree that another human being planted, just the ground and the sky and the silence and 8 people and every creature that breathes, organized by family, stepping out of the structure that kept them, beginning to fill the empty ground, with the sounds of life returning to a world that had been without it. Now here is what Noah does first. Not what survival logic would suggest. Not what the immediate practical demands of 8 people and thousands of animals on empty ground would seem to require. Genesis chapter 8. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. He built an altar before anything else, before shelter, before planting, before the assessment of resources and the planning of what comes next and the organization of the enormous practical challenges of beginning again from nothing. Before any of that, Noah built an altar and offered what he had on it. Think about what this means in terms of the animals. The clean animals came onto the ark in groups of 7. 7 pairs. They were the ones set apart for sacrifice as well as for reproduction. Noah takes some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird. He is giving back from the first and smallest and most fragile inventory of the new world. Something that costs him, in a world where every living thing that survived did so in the ark, where the population of every species is the thin reed on which the future of that species depends. Offering animals in sacrifice is not a costless gesture. It is the most significant thing Noah owns in this new world. And the first thing he does with any of it is give some back. But the altar is not just about what is given. It is about what the giving establishes. In the ancient world, an altar was the designated meeting point between the human and the divine, the physical structure that marked a place as a place where the two worlds touched. Building an altar was not a religious formality. It was an act of orientation, a person saying, with stone and fire and the lives of animals, this is where I stand in relation to what I stand before. Noah's first act in the new world is to establish his orientation. Before he does anything for himself, before he builds a house, or plants a field, or organizes the overwhelming practical work of starting over, he orients himself. He establishes the relational ground from which everything else will grow. And in doing so, he reveals something about himself that the story has been showing us in other ways, but never quite this directly. Noah knows what matters most. Not in the abstract theological sense of having the correct doctrinal priorities. In the lived, embodied, practical sense of a man who steps out onto the ground of a new world, and the first thing his hands reach for is not the materials to build his own shelter, but the stones to build an altar. The inside matches the outside. He is Tamim, undivided. The same person who walked with God through the old world is walking with God on the ground of the new one. He has not been changed by survival into something that forgets what made survival possible. Now there is something else happening at the altar that deserves attention. Something in the quality of the act itself that speaks to the state of the man performing it. Noah does not speak at the altar. The text records no words from Noah in this scene. No prayer. No declaration. No explanation of what he is doing or why. He builds. He takes. He offers. The offering is the speech. This is consistent with everything Genesis has shown us about Noah from the beginning. He is a man of action, not of words. He builds what he is told to build, without recorded comment. He gathers without recorded question. He enters when told to enter. Exits when told to exit. And now, in the first moment of complete freedom he has had in more than a year, the moment when no one has told him what to do and the whole empty world is waiting for him to decide, he builds an altar without being told to. This is the only thing in the entire story of Noah that he does entirely on his own initiative. Every other action is in response to a divine command. But the altar is not commanded. Genesis records no instruction to Noah to build an altar upon leaving the ark. It is something he does because it is what he is. And then God responds. Not to Noah. Genesis chapter 8. Verse 21 opens with something we need to stay with before moving on. Because what follows is the most important and the most concentrated sentence in the entire Noah story. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart. He said in his heart. Not to Noah. To himself. The smoke from Noah's altar rises into a cleared sky. And what it rises into is not silence. It rises into a moment of divine decision, made privately, in the interior life of God. In response to the offering of a man standing on empty ground, we will stay with what God says to himself in the next chapter, because it deserves its own space. It is the sentence that changes the direction of everything that comes after the flood, and it requires more room than the closing of this chapter can give it. But for now, stay with the altar. Stay with the image of the man standing in front of the fire he made, on the ground of the new world, before he has done a single thing for his own survival, sending smoke up into a sky that has cleared. This is Noah at his most whole, his most integrated, his most clearly himself, the man who walked with God, who built without complaint, who waited without breaking, who came out of the ark and built an altar before he built anything else. This is the Noah that the favor of God found in the ruined world. The man whose first act on empty ground was not to claim it, but to orient himself within it. The altar is beautiful. The altar is real. But survival does not preserve people in their best moments. Survival strips away the structures and routines and social contexts that hold a person in a particular shape and exposes what is underneath. And what is underneath a human being? Any human being, the most righteous human being in the world, is still a human being. The altar is where Noah stands at the beginning of the new world. The vineyard is where he arrives later. Both are true. Both will matter. But for now, the smoke is still rising. And God is responding, not to Noah, to himself, with something that will change how the world goes forward from this moment. Some things do not require words. Some things are said completely by what your hands do when no one has told you what to do. Noah builds the altar. The smoke rises. The empty sky receives it. Chapter 10. What God said to himself. There is a verse in Genesis chapter 8 that almost every reader moves through too quickly. It sits between the altar Noah builds and the blessing God pronounces, between the old world ending and the new one being formally established. It is easy to treat as a transitional sentence, something that bridges one significant moment to the next. It is not a bridge. It is the most theologically concentrated sentence in the entire Noah story. And what gives it that weight is not what it says about Noah, or about the flood, or about the world going forward. It is who God says it to. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. Said in his heart, not to Noah, not to the assembled creation stepping out of the ark by families into the new world, not to the heavenly court or any intermediary or any audience at all. God says this to himself, in the privacy of his own interior, in response to the smell of smoke from an altar that was never commanded. This is the only place in the entire flood narrative where God speaks without being in conversation with Noah. Every other divine statement in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 is addressed to Noah. Command, instructions, promises. But this one is interior, personal, set in the heart, which in the Hebrew understanding is not just the seat of emotion, but the seat of thought and will, and the deepest motivational core of a being. God is thinking something through. And what he thinks through is the most surprising reversal in the story. Look at the logic of it carefully, because the logic is where the surprise lives. Before the flood, God surveys the world and arrives at a conclusion. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The intention of the human heart is evil. This is the diagnosis. This is why the flood is sent. After the flood, God surveys the altar Noah has built and arrives at a decision. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. The intention of the human heart is evil. The same observation, the same assessment of the same condition. Before the flood, this observation leads to the decision to destroy. After the flood, the identical observation leads to the decision never to destroy this way again. The same truth about human nature. Two opposite conclusions. This is not a logical contradiction. It is a window into something real about what God is deciding in this moment. And to understand it, we need to stay with what has happened between the first time the observation is made and the second. The flood happened. The world was destroyed. Every creature that breathed was lost except the 8 people and the animals in the ark. The most complete act of judgment in the entire Hebrew Bible was executed from beginning to end. And then Noah stepped out onto dry ground and built an altar. And the altar did something to the logic. Before the flood, the evil of the human heart was the reason for judgment. The intention of man's heart is evil. Therefore, destroy. After the flood, the evil of the human heart is the reason for restraint. The intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Therefore, never again. What changed? Not human nature. God himself acknowledges that human nature is what it is. The intention of the heart is evil from its youth. The youth is significant. It means from the beginning, from the earliest point of human development, not as the result of accumulated bad choices or deliberate moral decline. From youth, from the start, human beings are bent this way from the beginning of their being human. God knows this before the flood. He knows it after the flood. The flood did not change it. What changed is what God decides to do with what he knows. And to understand why the decision changes, you have to look at what just happened at the altar. Noah stepped out of the ark onto a world that the flood had scoured clean. Every resource available to him was precious and finite. Every animal that came off the ark was irreplaceable. Every decision about how to use what he had would shape the fragile beginning of everything that followed. And the first thing Noah did was give some of it back. He built an altar. He took the clean animals and offered them, without being told to, without a command preceding it, without a voice from heaven directing his hands. Just a man, on empty ground, reaching for stones and fire because that is what was in him to do, and what is in Noah to do, in this unstructured and unconstrained moment, is to orient himself toward the one he has been walking with. God smells the offering. The phrase, "the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma," is one of the most anthropomorphic descriptions of God in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it has made readers uncomfortable for centuries. It describes God experiencing something through the physical sense of smell. Ancient readers struggled with it theologically. Modern readers sometimes struggle with it aesthetically. But the anthropomorphism is doing something precise. Smell is the most immediate and least mediated of the senses. You cannot close your nose the way you can close your eyes. You cannot hold a smell at arm's length the way you can hold a visual image. Smell arrives without announcement and triggers response before the mind has processed the source. When Genesis says God smelled the pleasing aroma, it is describing the most intimate possible form of reception. The offering reaches God directly, without distance, without mediation, bypassing all the layers of consideration and going straight to the response. And the response moves in the opposite direction from judgment. I will never again curse the ground because of man. The ground was cursed once before. Back in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were driven from the garden, the ground brought forth thorns and thistles. The relationship between human beings and the earth was marked by the curse. The flood is in some sense the culmination of that curse. The full weight of the broken relationship between humanity and creation making itself felt. But after the altar, after the smell of Noah's offering, God says no more. Not because the ground deserves better. Not because human beings have proven themselves worthy of uncursed ground, but because the alternative, the repeated destruction of a world that human beings will continue to corrupt because it is in their nature to corrupt it, is not the answer. Destruction cannot reach what needs to be reached. The problem is in the heart, and you cannot solve a problem in the heart by destroying the ground the heart walks on. The flood proved that. It proved it definitively. Once, so that it would not need to be proved again. And in the proving, the decision never again became necessary. Not as a reward, as the logical consequence of a God who understood what the flood had demonstrated. The answer is not destruction. The answer is something else that God does not name here. He names what he will not do. He does not yet name what he will do instead. But the not destroying is the beginning of an answer taking shape. An answer that will take the rest of the Bible to unfold. An answer that starts with the covenant about to be announced to Noah and continues through Abraham and the prophets and everything that follows. And then God says something that extends the promise beyond Noah. Genesis chapter 8, verse 22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, shall not cease. The rhythms of the world are guaranteed. Not for Noah specifically. For the earth, for as long as the earth remains, the seasonal cycles, the alternation of day and night, the reliable succession of planting time and harvest time, are being written into the fabric of creation as a promise. The world will remain stable enough to be inhabited and cultivated. The ground will receive seed and produce harvest. The year will turn as years are supposed to turn. This is not a dramatic promise. It is the most fundamental promise possible, because everything human civilization depends on, every form of life and community and building and culture and art and everything else that human beings do with their time on earth, depends on the simple reliability of a world that continues to function. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. God is promising the conditions that make human life possible. Before he has said anything directly to Noah, before the formal covenant, before the rainbow, in his own heart, in the private interior of the divine response to smoke rising from an altar on empty ground, God has already decided. The world continues. Now we have to stay with what is most uncomfortable about this moment, because the text earns the discomfort. The decision God makes here, the never again of verse 21, is made in full knowledge that the human beings who will inhabit the continuing world are still bent from their youth toward the same things. God is not deciding never to destroy again because he believes the problem has been fixed. He is deciding never to destroy again despite knowing that the problem has not been fixed. He is choosing to live with the problem. He is choosing to remain in relationship with a creature whose nature he fully understands, and whose nature he is not going to unilaterally alter to make the relationship easier. And what changes after the flood is not human nature. What changes is God's explicit commitment to the continuation of the world despite human nature. The problem that made the flood necessary is still there. The flood is not the solution to the problem. It is the establishment of the conditions under which the solution can be worked out over time. The long time, the complicated time, the time that involves Abraham arguing with God and Moses interceding for Israel and prophets crying out to a people that will not hear. All of that is made possible by this, by the decision made in a heart, in response to smoke from a fire, on empty ground, before anyone asked him to decide. The world was given back not because it deserved to be given back. The world was given back because the one who made it decided to stay in it. And that decision, private and unannounced and never formally explained, is the ground on which every page of the rest of the Bible is written. Chapter 11. The Warrior's Bow. There is a word in Hebrew that appears in Genesis chapter 9, and that almost every English translation renders the same way. Rainbow. It is not wrong. Exactly. The image is accurate. What God places in the sky after the flood is the arc of color that appears when sunlight passes through water in the air. The thing every child learns to associate with rain ending and clearing skies and the particular relief of a storm that has passed. But the Hebrew word is not a word invented for this moment. It is an old word, a word with a history and a weight that the translation rainbow does not carry, a word that every reader in the ancient world would have recognized immediately from a completely different context. The word is keshet, and keshet means a bow, not a decorative bow, not a ceremonial bow, a weapon, the weapon that warriors carried into battle. The bow that sent arrows across distances and ended lives. The bow that armies used. The bow that appears dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible in the context of warfare and hunting and the concentrated capacity for violence that a drawn bow represents. When God says in Genesis chapter 9, verse 13, "I have set my bow in the cloud," he is not describing the placement of a colorful arch in the sky. He is describing a weapon. And the weapon is pointed upward. This image would have landed with a weight on ancient readers that it largely does not land with modern ones. Because modern readers do not live in a world where the bow is the primary instrument of lethal force at a distance. But in the world of Genesis, everyone understood what a bow was for. Everyone had seen a bow drawn. Everyone understood the relationship between a drawn bow and the death that bow could produce. And everyone would have understood what it meant for the bow to be placed in the cloud with the string facing the sky. A warrior who has finished fighting does not keep the bow drawn. He unstrings it. He hangs it up. The bow in its resting position, aimed and ready, points toward the enemy. The bow laid down, tension released, is just wood. But there is a middle position, the bow that is still strung but has been turned away from the enemy. The bow whose string still holds the potential for lethal force but whose direction has been changed. The bow that is neither destroyed nor actively aimed. The bow in the cloud, pointed upward, is God's weapon turned away from the earth. Not destroyed, not pretending the capacity for judgment does not exist. The bow is still the bow. The force it represents is still real. The capacity for the kind of action that just happened is still present in the one who carries it. But the direction has changed. It is aimed at the sky, or perhaps more precisely, it is aimed at no one. Now look at the covenant itself. Because the covenant is as extraordinary as the sign that seals it. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 11. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." Read who this covenant is made with. Noah, his sons, their offspring after them, and with every living creature that is with you, and with every beast of the earth, as many as came out of the ark, This is a covenant with all flesh, not with Israel, which does not yet exist as a people, not with believers, not with the righteous, not with the people who have earned it, or sought it, or asked for it, not even just with human beings, with every living creature, with the birds, with the livestock, with every beast of the earth. This is the most universal covenant in the entire Bible. It is made before any particular people exists, before circumcision, before the law, before the temple, before any of the specific terms of relationship between God and the people He will eventually choose, before any of the conditions that will later define the covenant between God and Israel. This covenant has no conditions. Read it again and notice what is not there. There is no if in this covenant. No, unless, no, provided that. No statement of what Noah or his descendants or the animals of the earth are required to do in order for the covenant to remain in force. The other covenants in Genesis, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant at Sinai with Israel, those covenants have obligations on both sides. They require something from the human party. The Noahic covenant requires nothing. God is binding Himself to a commitment that is entirely one-sided. He is not negotiating. He is not establishing terms that can be violated and would then release him from the obligation. He is making a promise with no exit clause, directed at every living thing that breathes, regardless of what those living things do or become or fail to be. The covenant holds whether human beings are righteous or corrupt. It held through the construction of Babel. It held through the centuries of exile and return that the Hebrew prophets described. It held through everything that the history of Israel and the history of humanity produced in the millennia after Noah walked off the ark. It holds now. Because the condition for the covenant is not human behavior. The condition is God's decision, made in His heart, over Noah's altar, to stay in relationship with a world whose nature He fully understands and has chosen not to use as grounds for withdrawal. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again. Two of the most absolute words in the language, placed together, carrying the full weight of a divine commitment. Not, probably not. Not under most circumstances. Not unless things get bad enough. Never again. The flood was a singular event, not a template. Not a pattern that repeats when the threshold of human wickedness is reached. A singular event after which the terms changed permanently. Now think about the sequence of this covenant. God said in His heart, before announcing anything to Noah, that He would never again curse the ground because of man. That interior decision, private, unheard by Noah, was the foundation. Then the covenant is announced formally. Then the sign is placed in the sky. The sequence matters. God decided before He declared. He committed before He formalized. The covenant was real before it was announced. And then the sign. Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. The sign is for God, not only for Noah. This is the detail most readings of the rainbow miss. Verse 15 makes it explicit. I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. I will see it and remember. The rainbow is not primarily a reassurance to human beings that the storm is over and the flood will not return. It is a reminder to God of His own commitment. Every time the Keshet appears in the cloud, God sees it and the covenant is activated in the divine memory. The bow in the sky is God's own reminder of what He decided in His heart over an altar on empty ground. A God who sets up a reminder for Himself, who builds into the structure of the natural world a recurring sign that keeps the promise present in the divine awareness, who treats His own commitment with the seriousness of someone who understands that commitments require maintenance. that even a decision made freely and completely can be renewed and reaffirmed by the recurring sight of the sign that seals it. The keshet in the cloud is not decoration. It is the weapon of judgment, turned away from the earth, visible after every storm, reminding the one who placed it there of what he decided when the storm was real and the weapon was real and the question of what came after the judgment was still open. He decided to stay. He decided never again. He decided to bind himself to every creature that breathes, with no conditions, with no exit clause, with no provision for the covenant to be dissolved by anything that the creatures themselves might do. And he put a weapon in the sky as the sign of it, aimed upward. Now let us be honest about what this covenant does not do, because the covenant's limitations are as important as its content. The Noahic covenant is not a promise that the world will be good. It is not a promise that human beings will stop doing what they have always done. It is not a promise that Hamas will not fill the earth again, or that the corruption preceding the flood will not reassert itself in the world after it. It promises continuation. The world will continue. Seed time and harvest will not cease. The bow will stay turned away from the earth, and human beings will continue to be human beings, bent from youth, capable of exactly what the pre-flood world demonstrated, living in a world that God has committed to preserving despite his full knowledge of what they will do in it. The Noahic covenant is not the solution to the problem. It is the establishment of the conditions under which the solution can be worked toward. And the sign of all of that, the visible marker of a commitment made in private before it was announced in public, hangs in the sky after every rain. The keshet, still there, still turned away, the weapon of judgment laid down, the decision to stay written into the light. Noah is standing under it now, on the ground of the new world, with the altar smoke still rising and the animals spreading out around him and the family he brought through the water standing in the cleared sky. He sees the bow. He knows what it is and what it means. But the bow is not the end of his story, because Noah is still alive, and the world the covenant preserves is not a world of pure beginning. It is a world inhabited by a man who came through the water carrying everything the water could not wash from him. He is going to plant a vineyard. And what grows in that vineyard is not only grapes. Chapter 12. The Vineyard. There is a line in Genesis chapter 9 that most Sunday school versions of Noah never reach. It sits 11 verses after the rainbow, after the covenant, after the weapon placed in the sky and the promise of never again and the formal establishment of the new world and its new terms. After all of that, after the most significant divine commitment in human history up to that point has been made and sealed and signed with color in the sky. 11 verses later. Genesis chapter 9, verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. That is how it starts. Quietly, domestically, a man and a field and a decision to plant something. But the Hebrew of that verse is doing something the English translation obscures, something the rabbis noticed and argued about, and that deserves to be brought into the open before we go any further. The word translated as began is the Hebrew wayahel. It comes from the root halal, and halal does not mean simply to start or to begin in the neutral sense of initiating an activity. Halal carries a secondary meaning that appears in the Hebrew Bible in significant places. It can mean to make common, to profane, to reduce something from a higher state to a lower one. The same root appears in the word for desecration. The same root underlies descriptions of priests who violate the holiness of their office. When Genesis says, Noah began to be a man of the soil, the word it uses has within it the suggestion of a beginning that is also a diminishment. Noah is beginning something, and the beginning is, in one register of the word, a falling. He plants a vineyard. He drinks of the wine. He becomes drunk. He lies uncovered in his tent. 4 actions. each one building on the last, each one moving further from the man who stepped off the ark and built an altar before he built anything else. And the text watches all four without commentary, without judgment, with the silence of a narrative that trusts the accumulation of simple facts to carry what evaluation would only reduce. Now we have to ask the question that most readings of this passage either avoid or answer too quickly. Why does Noah get drunk? Not in the mechanical sense. The mechanics are simple. Grapes, fermentation, wine, too much wine. That part requires no explanation. In the deeper sense of what is happening to this man in this moment, what is Noah carrying that he puts down in the vineyard? Think about what this man has been through. He received a word that ended his life as he had known it. He spent years building something in public, in full view of people who did not believe what he believed. Sustaining a conviction with no external confirmation over a period that most people cannot sustain any conviction through. He loaded every breathing creature into the structure he built. He heard the door close from the outside. He heard whatever he heard when the water came. He floated for more than a year above a world dissolving beneath him. He sent birds through a small window and waited for them to come back. He saw a leaf and knew what it meant. He waited to be told to exit because he understood that the entering and the exiting were not his to decide. He stepped out onto empty ground and built an altar before he built anything else. He received a covenant that bound the Creator of the world to every living thing that breathed, sealed with the image of a weapon in the sky. And then he planted a vineyard. The man who survived the end of the world planted a vineyard. And the vineyard is where something in him, something that was held together through all of it by the pressure and purpose of the mission, begins to release. Now here is the thing about this that most readings miss entirely. Noah was a man shaped by a mission. The mission organized him. It gave structure to every day and meaning to every decision and a framework that held him upright through things that would have broken most people. He knew what he was for. He knew what his hands were supposed to do and why the doing of it mattered. The mission was the spine of his identity for as long as the mission lasted. And then the mission ended. He came out of the ark. He built the altar. He received the covenant. The new world was established. And Noah was still there. Still alive. Still breathing. But the organizing purpose that had structured his existence was complete. What do you do when the thing that made you who you are is finished? This is not a question unique to survivors of literal catastrophes. Every person who has poured themselves into something enormous and completed it knows the particular emptiness that follows. The strange quiet of having done the thing you were supposed to do and arriving on the other side to find that the other side is just more life. Unstructured and unmarked and without the clear directive that made the previous life feel purposeful. Noah plants a vineyard. He does not plant a temple. He does not build a city or establish the institutions of the renewed civilization. He plants a vineyard, which is the particular choice of a man who wants something to tend that grows slowly, that requires patient attention, that produces something capable of altering the experience of being in a body. The grape is a patient plant. It does not produce what it is capable of producing quickly. It requires years of cultivation. Noah, who spent years building something that the world around him thought was pointless, who waited through months sealed in the dark before the water came, who waited for a dove and for a word before he stepped outside, is now spending years growing something that will eventually produce the specific thing he is moving toward. He is moving toward the thing that wine provides, the temporary relief from feeling the full weight of what he carries. And when he arrives, he does not do it in measured doses. He drinks until he is exposed, until his body is uncovered in his tent, until the man who built the ark and walked with God is lying vulnerable and unguarded in the space where he thought he was alone. He is not alone. Genesis chapter 9, verse 22. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Ham saw, and Ham told. The nakedness of a father in the ancient world was not merely a physical state. A father's nakedness was his vulnerability, his private self stripped of the dignity and authority that defined his public identity. To see a father's nakedness was to see him in a condition he had not chosen to present, that stripped away the role and revealed only the man. And Ham tells his brothers, the text does not give us Ham's tone or his expression or his motive. It gives us only the sequence. He saw. He went outside. He told. But the telling is where the problem lives. Because there are things a son does when he finds his father in a condition of vulnerability. He covers it. He turns away. He protects the dignity of the man in whose shadow his own identity was formed. He does what Shem and Japheth do when they hear what Ham has told them. Genesis chapter 9, verse 23. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. They walked backward. They chose not to see. And in choosing not to see, they chose something about who they were in relation to their father. They chose the version of themselves that covers rather than exposes, that protects rather than reports, that treats a parent's weakness as something sacred in its vulnerability. Ham made a different choice. He saw and he told. And the difference between those two responses to the same situation is the difference between two ways of being in relation to the people you come from. One way says, what I find in you is mine to protect. The other says, what I find in you is mine to share. Noah wakes up. Genesis chapter 9, verse 24. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he knew. And then Noah, the man who did not speak a recorded word through the building of the ark or the flood or the covenant, opens his mouth, and what comes out is a curse. We will stay with that curse and everything it carries in the next chapter, because it deserves more space than the closing of this one can give it. But for now, hold the vineyard. Hold the image of the man who survived the end of the world, who walked with God through the worst and the best of what any human being had yet experienced, lying uncovered in a tent in his vineyard while his sons stand outside in the night. This is not a fall from grace, in the simple sense that phrase usually implies. This is what survival looks like when it has nowhere left to go but inward. When the mission is done, and the covenant is signed, and the bow is in the sky, and the world is being repopulated, and there is nothing left to build toward. What does the man who was built for the mission do, with the weight of everything the mission cost him? He plants a vineyard. He tends it. He drinks from it. He is human. And being human, after everything, is the most honest thing the story of Noah has yet shown us. The altar was real. The vineyard is also real. Both are the same man. And the same man is still lying in his tent, with everything the night will bring. Chapter 13. The Silence of Ham. There is a question the previous chapter raised and did not fully answer. Why Canaan? Ham looked. Ham told. Ham is the one who failed to do what Shem and Japheth did, who failed to walk backward with a garment on his shoulders, who treated his father's vulnerability as something to share rather than something to cover. Ham is the one whose action produced the situation that Noah woke into. And Noah cursed Canaan, not Ham, his grandson, the son of the son who transgressed, the child who, as far as Genesis records, was not present in the scene at all. This is the question that has occupied serious readers of this passage for longer than almost any other exegetical problem in Genesis. And it requires honest engagement rather than a quick resolution, because the text does not offer a quick resolution. Before we can address why the curse lands where it lands, we have to address something that most readings of Genesis chapter 9 move past too quickly. We have to address what Ham actually did. The text says Ham saw the nakedness of his father, but in the Hebrew Bible, that phrase carries a range of meaning that the simple visual act of looking does not fully capture. In Leviticus chapter 18, The same phrase and the same grammatical construction appear consistently in the context of sexual violation. Uncovering the nakedness of someone in Leviticus is not a metaphor for accidental visual exposure. It is the language of serious transgression. Some interpreters, working within the ancient rabbinic tradition and continuing through modern scholarship, have read Ham's action not as simply glancing at a naked man through an open tent flap, but as something more severe. The Talmudic tractate Sanhedrin contains a debate in which some rabbis suggest the transgression was sexual in nature. Others read it as an act of deliberate disrespect designed to humiliate and diminish. Still others maintain the plain reading while arguing that the public manner of the telling transformed a private act into a social violation of serious consequence. Each reading is attempting to account for the severity of the curse by proposing that the underlying act was more serious than the text states plainly. What is not in dispute is the comparison the text itself draws. Ham saw his father's nakedness and went outside and told. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward. The contrast is the interpretation. Whatever Ham did in the moment of seeing, what follows is a choice about what to do with the seeing. And the choice Ham makes is to take the private vulnerability of his father and make it into something shared. Shem and Japheth make the opposite choice. They take the same information and make it into something covered. There are always two things you can do when you find someone you love in a condition of exposure. You can protect it, or you can pass it along. Shem and Japheth protect it. Ham passes it along. And Noah wakes up knowing. Now, why Canaan? The honest answer begins with acknowledging what the text does not tell us and what we therefore cannot claim to know with certainty. Genesis does not explain the decision. Noah speaks the curse, and Genesis records it without editorial comment, without divine endorsement, without any apparatus that would tell us whether the curse is prophetic inspiration channeled through Noah's mouth or the wounded anger of a man who has just been exposed. But several lines of interpretation have circulated through the centuries, and being honest about them matters. One reading suggests that Canaan was somehow involved in the scene in a way the text does not explicitly record. That the mention of Ham as the father of Canaan in verse 22 is not incidental, but deliberately links the son to the father's action. That Canaan may have been present, may have participated, may have instigated what Ham then reported. Under this reading, the curse lands on Canaan because Canaan was there. Another reading focuses on the nature of generational consequence in the ancient world. A curse or a blessing directed at a son was understood to affect the family line that son would produce. Noah, in cursing the line that would descend from Ham through Canaan, was not so much punishing an individual child as declaring a trajectory for the people that child's descendants would become. The Table of Nations in the next chapter will tell us that the Canaanites are among Ham's descendants. The Canaanites are the people who will occupy the land that Israel is later commanded to take. The conflict between Israel and Canaan, between the descendants of Shem, through whom the line of blessing runs, and the descendants of Ham through Canaan, plays out across centuries of the biblical narrative. Reading backward from that conflict, some interpreters have argued that Noah's curse was less a personal punishment of an individual grandson and more a prophetic identification of a historical trajectory already taking shape. The third reading, and the one I find most honest about the genuine difficulty of this text, is simply this. The curse of Canaan is strange. The logic does not fully satisfy. The gap between the action we are told about and the consequence we are shown is wider than any single interpretive framework cleanly bridges. And that strangeness is part of what the passage is showing us. Because this is Noah's story, and the strangeness of the curse, the way it lands on someone who is not quite the right target for the anger that generated it, is entirely consistent with everything we have been watching happen to Noah since he stepped off the ark. He is not a man operating at his best right now. He is a man operating from pain. And people operating from pain do not always aim their words where the logic of the situation would direct them. They aim at what is present, at what represents the thing that hurt them, at the closest available extension of the source of the wound. Ham's son was Canaan. Ham's action hurt Noah, and Noah, waking from the vulnerability that Ham turned into a spectacle, reaches for the curse that will land on the most immediate extension of the person who exposed him. Whether that curse was just in the formal sense we use the word just is a question the text does not answer. Noah is not conducting a trial. He is not rendering a verdict after deliberation. He is a man in pain, saying words in pain. And the words have consequences that will echo far beyond the tent and the vineyard and the man who planted it. Now we have to say something about the history of this passage's interpretation. Not as a footnote, as a moral necessity, this passage was weaponized. For centuries, across the history of the Western world, this curse was deployed as theological justification for the enslavement of African peoples, the identification of Ham as the ancestor of Africa, and the reading of this curse as divine sanction for the subjugation of Ham's descendants, was used by people who wanted religious authority for what was already a practice of extraordinary cruelty and economic convenience. The interpretation was wrong. It was wrong in every way that careful reading of a text can demonstrate wrongness. Ham is not the ancestor of Africa in any meaningful genealogical sense. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, which we will examine in the next chapter, describes Ham's descendants in terms of the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean world. No honest reading of that text can map Ham's line onto the racial categories that later interpreters imposed on it. The curse is not a divine endorsement of slavery. It is the recorded words of a wounded man. Genesis never presents Noah's curse as God's word. God has not spoken in this passage. God's most recent words in this story are the covenant of never again, the blessing and covenant of verses 1 through 17, the promise of the bow in the cloud, the commitment to every creature that breathes. What follows the covenant, in verses 20 through 27, is Noah speaking. Noah, who has just woken from drunkenness, who is wounded and exposed and angry, who has discovered that one of his sons treated his vulnerability as spectacle. A wounded man's angry words, spoken in a tent, over a private humiliation, are not a theological foundation for anything. The people who used this text to justify slavery were not reading Genesis. They were using a word in Genesis as a tool for something they had already decided to do. And the people who suffered under the weight of that misreading deserved far better than to have the words of a pain-drunk patriarch deployed as the justification for their chains. We return now to Noah. He has spoken the curse. He has also, in the same passage, pronounced blessings over Shem and Japheth. The same moment of pain that produces the curse also produces the blessing. The same man, the same morning, both things coming out of the same wounded human being. This is consistent with everything the story has shown us. Noah is not a man of only one quality. He is Tamim, undivided. And that means the whole of him is present in every moment. The righteous and the wounded, the man who walked with God and the man who lay uncovered in the tent, the man who built the altar and the man who cursed his grandson in pain. He is not divided into a good side and a bad side. He is whole, which means his wholeness includes the parts that are painful to look at directly. The curse is real. The blessings are real. The vineyard is real. The altar is real. Noah is real. And reality, for a human being who has survived what Noah survived, is not clean. It is not a story that ends at the rainbow. It is the vineyard and the tent and the curse and the blessing and the long, complicated, mortal continuation of a life that the water did not finish and that survival did not simplify. That continuation is what we follow now. Out of the tent, into the world that Noah's survival made possible, and into the question of whether that world, built from the same human material as the one the water washed away, will go somewhere different this time. The answer is already being written in the lives of the people who walked off the ark. It is not the answer any of them would have chosen, but it is the honest answer, and the honest answer is what this story has always been about. Chapter 14, The Table of Nations. There is a chapter in Genesis that almost no one reads for pleasure. It is chapter 10, The Table of Nations. 70 names arranged in genealogical order under the 3 sons of Noah, each name representing a people or a place or a political entity in the ancient world. Each name connected to the others by the repeated formula, and his sons, and his sons, tracing the branching of humanity from the 8 people who walked off the ark into every direction that the ancient world knew. Most readers encounter this chapter and do their best to get through it quickly. That is a mistake. Because Genesis chapter 10 is not a boring genealogy. It is one of the most carefully constructed passages in the entire Torah. It is making an argument, quietly and through the specific choices of what to include and where to place it. That changes the meaning of everything preceding it and everything that follows. The argument is this: the whole world came from this family, not Israel. Not a chosen group with a special claim on humanity's origin story. Every people, every nation, every language group in the known world of the ancient Near East, and by extension the entire human family, traces its ancestry back to the 3 men who walked off the ark with their father and their wives. 70 nations. The number is not accidental. 70 in Hebrew numerical imagination is the number of fullness and completion. 70 elders accompany Moses. 70 members of Jacob's family go down to Egypt. 70 is the number that means all of them. The complete set. The whole. 70 nations from 3 families from 1 man. The whole human world in the new creation is 1 family. Now look at the structure of the table more carefully. Because the structure is doing work, the names alone do not do. The chapter gives us the descendants of Japheth first, then the descendants of Ham, then the descendants of Shem. This is the reverse of the order in which the sons are usually listed. When Genesis introduces the sons of Noah, it consistently says Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but the table works through them in opposite order, saving Shem for last. This is not a mistake. In Hebrew narrative, the last position is the position of emphasis. The one who comes last in a list is the one the narrative is moving toward, by saving Shem for last. The table is marking Shem's line as the one the story will follow next. This matters because of what comes immediately after chapter 10. Chapter 11 is Babel, and then chapter 12 is Abraham. Abraham is a descendant of Shem, in the specific lineage that Genesis chapter 11 traces from Shem, through Arphaxad, through Shelah, through Eber, through Peleg, through Reu, through Serug, through Nahor, through Terah, to Abram. The Table of Nations is not just a catalog of the ancient world. It is the map that shows us where the story is going. But here is what we must not miss in focusing on where the story is going. The story is not abandoning the other 69 nations. This is the theological argument Genesis chapter 10 makes by its very existence. If the only thing that mattered were the Semitic line through which Abraham comes, why list all the others? Why name the descendants of Japheth, the peoples of the coastlands and the islands and the northern territories? Why catalog the descendants of Ham, including the Egyptians and the peoples of the ancient Near East? Why give us 70 when you only need 1 lineage to get from Noah to Abraham? Because all 70 matter. Because the covenant God made with Noah was made with all flesh. Because the promise of seed time and harvest and the bow in the cloud was made to every living creature. Because the Table of Nations is Genesis insisting, before the story narrows its focus to 1 family, that the narrowing is not an exclusion. The story focuses on Shem's line not because the other 69 nations are written off, but because the blessing that will eventually come through Shem's line is intended for all of them. The narrowing is not the end of the story for everyone else. It is the beginning of the means by which everyone else will eventually be reached. The 70 nations are not the background of the story of Israel. They are the intended recipients of what the story of Israel is working toward. Now look at what the table reveals about the world Noah's survival produced. Because it is not a picture of pure new beginning. From the descendants of Ham comes Nimrod. Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh. In the land of Shinar, Nimrod, the first named kingdom builder in the post-flood world, the first person described as founding cities and establishing an empire, the first person after Noah whose individual character is described in enough detail to give us a picture of someone specific rather than a representative ancestor. And the word used for Nimrod is Gibhor, mighty man. It is the same word used in Genesis chapter 6 for the Nephilim, the mighty men of the pre-flood world, the men of renown who were the most concentrated expression of Hamas in the world before the water came. The same word. 2 generations after Noah walked off the ark. The post-flood world is producing mighty men again. Nimrod builds Babel. He builds Nineveh. He builds the cities of Mesopotamia that will eventually become the great empires of Assyria and Babylon. The empires that will destroy the northern kingdom of Israel and carry Judah into exile. The world that Noah survived is producing, within living memory of the flood, the same kind of concentrated human power that the pre-flood world produced. The same ambitions, the same building, the same men of renown. The water washed the world. The world is already doing it again. And buried in the descendants of Shem is another detail that most readers miss entirely. Verse 25. In the genealogy of Shem's line, to Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg. For in his days the earth was divided. In his days the earth was divided. That phrase sits in the genealogy without elaboration. In the days of Peleg, something happened that the text marks as the moment of division. The earth was divided. Most interpreters connect this to the story immediately following in chapter 11, the story of Babel and the scattering of languages and peoples. In the days of Peleg, the unified humanity of the immediate post-flood world was scattered into the multiplicity of peoples and languages that characterize the world as we know it. The division is coming. The table of nations is placed before the story of Babel because the table shows us the result before we see the cause. We see the 70 nations already spread across the earth before Genesis chapter 11 tells us how the spreading happened. The diversity of humanity, all the nations and languages and peoples and cultures that have filled the earth since the earliest human history, is presented not as a tragedy but as a fact to be catalogued. The table does not describe the 70 peoples with regret. It lists them with the same clear-eyed enumeration of what is actually there. They are there. All of them. They came from Noah. They are the human world that the flood preserved when it preserved 8 people in a wooden structure above the receding waters. But the portrait is not a scene of peace. Nimrod is in it. Babel is in it. The nations that will go to war with each other for the next several thousand years of recorded history are all in it. 70 branches of one family, spreading across the world the covenant preserved. Each branch carrying within it the same nature that filled the pre-flood world with Hamas and filled God's heart with grief. The water washed the earth. The earth is filling again, with the same people, with the same nature, and the bow is still in the cloud. The promise is still in force. And the question that the flood raised and did not answer is sitting in the middle of the table of nations, visible in the name of Nimrod and the cities he builds and the division coming in Peleg's days, waiting for the chapter that will make it undeniable. The next chapter, the one with the tower, the one that proves what the table of nations is already quietly showing us, that the flood could wash the earth, that the earth grew back into itself, into what it was, and that something different from water will be needed to address what the water could not reach. Chapter 15. Babel. The Proof. There is a story in Genesis chapter 11 that runs exactly 9 verses long. 9 verses. The entire account of the construction and collapse of the Tower of Babel, one of the most famous episodes in all of human literature, occupies 9 verses of the Hebrew Bible. Shorter than the instructions for building the ark, shorter than the genealogy of Noah's descendants, shorter than the description of the animals being loaded. 9 verses. And yet those 9 verses answer the question the entire Noah story has been building toward. Not loudly, not with the dramatic weight that a pivotal answer usually carries. Quietly, almost matter-of-factly. The way a story sometimes delivers its most important content in the smallest possible space, trusting that the reader who has followed everything up to this point will feel the weight without needing it announced. The question was this: if the flood washed the world clean, why does the world that comes after the flood look so much like the world that came before it? Babel is the answer. Not a comfortable answer. Not a satisfying answer in the way we usually want answers to hard questions to be satisfying, but the honest answer that the story has been working toward since the moment Noah stepped off the ark, and the covenant was made, and the bow was placed in the cloud, and the world was given back to the same creatures whose nature God acknowledged had not changed. Here is what Genesis chapter 11 gives us. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks, and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Read that last sentence again. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. 2 motivations: the desire for a great name, and the fear of dispersal. Both of them deserve careful attention, because both of them tell us something specific about the nature of what is happening here. Start with the desire for a great name. In the narrative world of Genesis, making a name is not a neutral idiom for achieving something significant. It is a specific act with specific theological weight. Making a name is what God does for the people he chooses. When God calls Abram out of Ur in the very next chapter, the promise he makes is precise. "I will make your name great." God makes names great. At Babel, the people say, "Let us make a name for ourselves." They are attempting to do for themselves what the text reserves for God to do for others. They are trying to generate their own significance, to write their own importance into the world, to become the kind of people whose name outlasts them without needing anyone outside themselves to grant that kind of permanence. The theological problem with this, in the world of Genesis, it is not that human achievement is inherently wrong, or that ambition is always corrupting, or that building cities is a sin. The problem is the self-referential closed loop of it. We will make ourselves great, by our own effort, in our own city, on our own terms, without reference to anything outside the circle of our collective will. The world before the flood was organized around the same logic. The mighty men of old made themselves names. The Nephilim were men of renown. They generated their own significance through the accumulation of power and the exercise of that power without limit. And the result was Hamas, the systematic disorder that comes when human beings remove any reference point outside themselves and replace it with nothing but the logic of what they can take and keep and build. Babel is doing the same thing, in a new world, on dry ground, under a covenant that still holds, with the bow still in the cloud. Now the fear of dispersal, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. This fear is telling precisely because dispersal is exactly what God commanded Noah and his sons to do. Genesis chapter 9. Verse 1. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." Not gather in one place. Not build a city to prevent the filling from happening. Fill the earth. Spread. Go to every corner of the world that the flood washed and the covenant preserved. The Babel builders are refusing the blessing. They are afraid of the very thing the blessing commanded. They want to stay gathered, consolidated, concentrated, all in one place, where the collective power of their unified will can be directed toward the project of their own greatness. This is the other face of the same problem. The world before the flood concentrated power in the hands of the Nephilim. The world after the flood is concentrating power in the collective project of a unified humanity building toward the heavens. The mechanism is different. The impulse is the same. Individual accumulation before. Collective accumulation now. Same thing. Different scale. And this, not the physical height of the tower, is what the text means when God says in verse 6, "Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Nothing will be impossible for them." Read that carefully. It is not admiration. It is a diagnosis of an unchecked condition. A humanity without dispersal, without the limits that come from being spread across a world too large for any single project to encompass. Without the friction that arises from multiple perspectives and multiple languages and multiple ways of organizing human life, is a humanity that has no natural constraint on the direction of its collective will. And the collective will of human beings, bent from youth toward the same things the flood could not wash away, operating without constraint, will go where it went before the flood, toward the taking of everything, toward the accumulation of power in the hands of those strong enough to accumulate it, toward the world where the strong take any they choose. The tower is not the problem. The tower is the symptom. The problem is the same problem it always was. Human nature operating without limit. Now look at God's response. Genesis chapter 11, verse 7. "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." Come, let us go down. The same invitation that appeared in Genesis chapter 1. Let there be. Let us make. The divine deliberation that precedes creation. Here, it precedes something else. An interruption. An intervention. And the intervention is not destruction. This is important and easy to miss. God does not destroy Babel the way he destroyed the pre-flood world. He does not send water or fire or any of the instruments of judgment. He confuses. He scatters. He disperses. He does what the blessing commanded, and the Babel builders refuse to do. He fills the earth with them. The intervention is the implementation of the plan they were trying to prevent. You were afraid of being scattered. Now you are scattered. Not as punishment in the simple proportional sense. As the application of the design they refused to implement voluntarily. The earth was supposed to be filled. They declined to fill it. Now they fill it anyway. And they fill it in a particular way that the Table of Nations in chapter 10 already showed us the result of. They fill it as distinct peoples. As 70 nations with 70 languages and 70 ways of organizing life. As the multiplicity that the table cataloged before the story of how the multiplicity happened. The dispersal is not the tragedy. The dispersal is the world. The world we live in now. The world of different languages and different cultures and different ways of being human that developed across the centuries in the different corners of the earth that humanity spread to fill. The world where human diversity is so woven into what we understand humanity to be that we cannot imagine the alternative. The one language and the same words of the plain in Shinar. As anything other than impoverishment. There is a real loss in Babel. The loss of immediate communication. The loss of the unified project. The loss of the ability to speak directly to someone without the mediation of translation and approximation, and the gap that always exists between what one language means and what another language can carry. That loss is real. But the loss is not the only thing Babel produces. Babel also produces the world. The full, various, multitudinous human world. With its 70 languages and its 70 peoples and its 70 ways of singing and building and mourning and celebrating and understanding what it means to be alive in a body on the earth that the covenant preserved, all of that comes from Babel. Now here is what those 9 verses accomplish that nothing else in the Noah story quite manages. They prove what the whole story has been building toward, a demonstration of. Before the flood, the world filled itself with Hamas. God looked at it with grief. He sent the water. He preserved one man and his family through a long and costly act of faithfulness. After the flood, within 2 generations, the same impulse is operating again. Not in secret, not in the hidden corners of private vice. In public, on a plain in Shinar, in broad daylight, with brick and mortar and unanimous collective agreement. Let us make a name for ourselves. The water washed the earth. It did not touch what needed to be touched. The problem was never in the geography. It was never in the landscape or the cities or the accumulated structures of the civilization that the flood erased. Those were expressions of the problem. You can erase expressions without erasing what is being expressed. The problem was in the heart. The intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. God said that to himself. Over Noah's altar. Before the covenant was announced. He knew it then. Babel confirms it now. Not as news. As demonstration. As the visible. Historical. 9-verse proof that what God already knew in his heart was exactly as he knew it. And the bow is still in the cloud. And the promise of never again is still in force. And the God who decided to stay in the question is watching Babel happen from the place where he decided to stay. He is watching. He is not withdrawing the covenant. He is going down. Not to destroy. To scatter. To begin. By force. The filling of the earth that the blessing intended and the builders refused. And then, in the very next chapter, he will call one man, out of Ur of the Chaldeans, out of the land where Nimrod built his kingdoms, out of the shadow of the tower that proved the flood was not enough. He will call one man and begin, in a way completely different from water. The work that the flood demonstrated needed to be done differently. Not by washing, by choosing, by working through one family, through the grain of human nature rather than against it, toward something that the prophets will eventually describe as a new heart. Not a cleaned earth, a changed interior, the transformation that no flood can produce, but that relationship, maintained across generations, might begin to approach. That story begins after this one ends. But this story ends here, with 9 verses, with the tower standing unfinished on the plain in Shinar, with the workers scattered across the earth they were told to fill and refused to fill, and with the question the flood raised, answered not with hope but with honesty. The water was not enough. Something more is needed. Something the story of Noah could not provide, but without which the story of Noah could not have begun. The bow is in the cloud. God is in the question. And the next chapter of the longest story ever told is about to begin. Chapter 16. The man who lived to 950. Genesis chapter 9. Verses 28 and 29. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years. And he died. 2 sentences. 350 years compressed into 2 sentences. The second of which is almost entirely a number and a final fact. 950 years. And he died. Genesis does this with the long-lived patriarchs. It gives the number and the final phrase and moves on. Methuselah lived 969 years, and he died. Jared lived 962 years, and he died. The pattern is consistent, and the compression is deliberate. These lives are not being minimized. They are being marked. The length is the content. The dying at the end is the punctuation. But Noah is different from the others in the genealogy. And the difference is not only the flood. The others in Genesis chapter 5 are ancestors. They live and have children and die, and the narrative notes them because they are in the line that leads somewhere. Their lives are recorded because their lives produced the next generation. Noah is not only an ancestor, he is the survivor. The one person in all of that genealogy who experienced something none of the others experienced, who was sealed inside a wooden structure while the world he had known for 600 years dissolved beneath him, who walked out onto empty ground and built an altar and received a covenant and planted a vineyard and cursed his grandson and watched his sons scatter across the repopulating earth. He lived 350 years after all of that. Think about what 350 years means in terms of what Noah witnessed. The genealogical table of Genesis chapter 11 allows us to calculate the overlapping of lifespans in the post-flood world with a precision unusual in ancient literature. If we take the numbers at their face value, the picture that emerges is striking. Shem, Noah's son, outlived his father. His lifespan in the text extends past Noah's death and runs for centuries beyond it. Ham and Japheth similarly lived long post-flood lives. The world that emerged from the ark was a world where the original 8 survivors lived long enough to see multiple generations of descendants. Noah lived long enough to see the world fill with those descendants. He lived long enough to see cities rise, to see the peoples of the Table of Nations take their places across the ancient world. The chronology of the post-flood genealogies places Babel within the span of lifetimes that overlap with Noah's. He may have seen the tower going up. He may have watched, from the long distance of his years, the same thing beginning again that had happened before. The gathering of power, the building toward significance, the human project aimed at the heavens. He may have recognized it the way a person recognizes a pattern they have lived through. The way someone who has seen a direction taken before knows where it is going before it arrives. He may have seen the dispersal afterward, the scattering, the languages dividing, the 70 nations going their 70 directions, and he did not say a word, not one recorded word about any of it. This is the man who did not speak through the building of the ark, who said nothing in any way that Genesis records during the years of construction, or the years in the sealed ark, or the years of waiting for a word that would tell him to step outside. The man who received the covenant in silence, and planted the vineyard in silence, and cursed his grandson, and blessed his other sons, and then continued living in the silence that had always been the texture of his presence in the world. 350 years of silence after the flood. Now we have to ask what that silence means across the long aftermath. Because Noah was not simply absent during those 350 years. He was present. He was alive. He was the man who survived the end of the world. The man who received the covenant. The man whose name was attached to the most significant divine commitment in human history up to that point. He was in the world while the world was doing what the world was doing. The vineyard is the image Genesis gives us for Noah in the post-flood years. Not building, not leading, not prophesying or ruling or organizing the new civilization that his survival made possible. Planting and tending and drinking. A vineyard is a patient thing. It requires years before it produces what it is capable of producing. It requires consistent attention. It requires a person who is not looking for immediate results, who is willing to invest labor in something that will take time to give back what it was planted to produce. Noah, who spent years building something for an event that had not yet happened, who waited through 7 days, sealed in an ark before the water came, who floated for more than a year waiting to be told to exit, is now tending a vineyard. He has become a man of slow things, A man whose relationship to time has been permanently altered by the experience of having waited through the longest and heaviest waiting that any human being had yet endured. And in the vineyard, something the waiting produces is wine. And in the wine, something that Noah finds is what the wine provides: the temporary setting down of weight. The hours when the full accumulated heaviness of what he carries is muted just enough to breathe. This is the picture Genesis gives us of the man who survived the end of the world in his later years. Not triumphant, not prophetically active, not the elder statesman of a new civilization offering wisdom to the generations that followed. A man in a vineyard, drinking what his vineyard produces, lying uncovered in a tent, and living for 350 more years. There is a particular kind of existence that the long years after Noah's greatest trial describe. One that has no clean name in the language we usually use to talk about people who have survived enormous things. We understand the acute phase, the crisis, the building of the ark, the flooding of the world, the survival, the covenant. We know how to talk about the moment of greatest pressure and the moment when the pressure lifts. We know how to describe the building and the flooding and the rainbow. We are less equipped to describe what comes after. The years when the greatest thing that ever happened to you is behind you, and the world is continuing, and you are still in it, and you are still yourself, carrying everything that the great thing left in you. And there is no framework that tells you what to do with the remainder. The years when the mission is complete but the life is not. The years when the covenant is in place and the bow is in the sky and the world is being populated and you are a man in a vineyard, waiting for grapes to ripen. In the world that your survival made possible, watching it become what it becomes. Those years are what Genesis compresses into 2 sentences. And they are not nothing. They are the full span of a human life after the extraordinary thing. The full arc of what survival means when survival goes on long enough to become simply living, when the survivor stops being defined primarily by what they survived and becomes again, or perhaps for the first time, simply a person in the world. Noah becomes again simply a person in the world, an enormous person in terms of what he has witnessed and carried. A person whose name is attached to the covenant that still holds, and whose life is the reason the world is populated and the story continues. But a person, growing grapes, growing old, growing into the particular kind of person that 350 years of post-catastrophe life makes of someone. He is not preserved in amber at his greatest moment, the way Utnapishtim was frozen at the edge of the world and made permanently inaccessible. He is returned to the ordinary, to the soil, to the daily rhythm of a life that has weight and weariness and the slow passage of seasons. And then comes the verse that Genesis uses to mark the end of every long life. And he died. 3 words in English. The phrase that closes every entry in the genealogy. The phrase that closes Noah's entry too. No scene, no gathering of family at the deathbed. No final words, no last blessing, no summation of the life offered by the man who lived it, the man who received the covenant of never again from the God who grieved the world, the man who walked with God through the old world, and the flood, and the empty ground of the new one, dies in 2 words, like everyone else. Unlike Utnapishtim, Noah was not exempted from it. He was given back to the world, and to the dying that the world requires of everything that lives in it. 950 years, and he died. Now here is the question that 2 sentences and a number force upon us. What was it for? Not in the theological sense of what was the purpose of the flood or the meaning of the covenant. Those questions have been engaged across the chapters we have covered. In the more personal sense, what did 350 years of post-flood existence produce? What did the life that Genesis marks with 2 sentences contribute to what came after? The answer Genesis gives is not immediately satisfying. It is not the kind of answer that makes a life feel sufficiently significant for the scale of what that life contained. Noah survived. His survival made the continuation of humanity possible. His children and their children populated the world, the covenant preserved. The 70 nations spread across the earth. Nimrod built his cities. Babel rose and fell. The languages divided. And somewhere in the line of Shem, through the generations that the genealogy of Genesis chapter 11 traces, a man named Terah had a son named Abram. And Abram heard a voice. The same voice that spoke to Noah in the old world. The same voice that gave the blueprint and the covenant and the never again. The same voice that had been speaking to human beings since the garden. That grieved over the world before the flood. That remembered Noah in the middle of the waters. That said in its heart over smoke from an altar on empty ground that it would not do this again. That voice called Abram. And what began with Abraham's response will eventually become the long and complicated story of how the God who stayed in the question after the flood begins. Slowly, and through many generations, to address what the flood could not address. Not by washing, by choosing, by working through one family, through the grain of human nature rather than against it, towards something that the prophets will describe in images that echo the garden before the fall and the world before the flood. Every valley lifted, every mountain made low, the wolf and the lamb feeding together. That story is not Noah's story. But Noah's story is why that story exists. Because if Noah had not been found when God looked at the grief-filled world, if the ark had not been built and the family had not been preserved and the covenant had not been made and the bow had not been placed in the cloud, if the world had ended completely and the human line had stopped at the generation before the flood, there would have been no Shem. There would have been no Eber. There would have been no Terah. There would have been no Abram standing in Ur of the Chaldeans when the voice called. Everything that follows from that calling, everything that the Hebrew Bible describes across the centuries after Abraham, everything that claims to continue and expand and eventually reach every people and every nation and every tongue, traces back through the genealogies to the man in the vineyard, to the man in the tent, to the man who received the covenant and cursed his grandson and lived 350 more years and died in 2 words, to Noah, who never said a word that Genesis recorded, who built what he was told to build, who walked in a direction the world around him was not going, who survived the end of the world, not because he was the greatest human being who ever lived, but because when God looked at a grief-filled world, Noah was in a place where the looking could find him, and that was enough. That was, in the economy of what God was working with, exactly enough, not more, not less, and he died. Chapter 17. What the water could not wash away. We began with a man inside a wooden ship, listening to the rain begin. We said we would not stop at the rainbow. We did not stop there. We followed him through the vineyard and the tent and the curse and the silence of 350 years and the 2 words at the end of it all. We followed the world he made possible through Babel and the table of nations and the scattering of 70 peoples across the earth, the covenant preserved. Now we are at the place where the thread we have been following asks to be held. Not concluded. Because the story of Noah does not offer a clean conclusion. It does not arrive at the place where everything is resolved and the meaning is packaged and the lesson fits in a sentence. It asks. And the asking is not a failure of the story to deliver what stories are supposed to deliver. The asking is the meaning. So let us hold what it has given us. The first thing this story insists on, from the opening verse of Genesis chapter 6 through the last verse that mentions Noah's name, is the most quietly radical claim the Hebrew Bible makes about human beings. You can be found, not because you are perfect. Noah was not perfect. The vineyard and the tent and the curse his grandson did not earn settle that question permanently. Not because you are morally superior to everyone around you in a way that makes your selection feel mathematically necessary. The text is careful not to establish that, but because in a world that has learned to forget, you can still remember. In a world going one direction, you can still be going another. In a world where God looks with grief and finds the whole of it bent away from what it was made for, you can be the person who, when the looking looks, is still oriented toward the one doing the looking. That is all. That is, in the economy of what God was working with. Exactly enough. The being found was not entirely on Noah's side. And that matters. The favor was seen before it was earned. The covenant was announced before the ark was built. The door was closed from outside. The remembering was God's act. The opening of the door was God's word. At every turning point in the story, the initiative is not Noah's. Noah responds. He builds when told to build. He enters when told to enter. He exits when told to exit. He receives what is given and does not demand what has not been offered. This is easy to misread as passivity. It is the specific form of active orientation that the text calls walking with God. The willingness to move in the direction that the walking is going, even when the direction requires building something enormous in public that no one believes in. Even when the direction requires entering a sealed space and waiting in the dark while the world outside ends. Even when the direction requires stepping out onto empty ground with no instructions except the general command to be fruitful and fill the earth. Walking with God, in the story of Noah, looks less like religious achievement and more like the daily maintenance of a direction. Not dramatic, not visibly productive in the short term, not generating the kind of external confirmation that most people require to sustain a conviction. Just a direction, held consistently, over a very long time, against a world that was going somewhere else entirely. That is what was found when God looked. A man still going in the right direction. Now here is the second thing this story insists on. The one that has been building since the moment Noah stepped off the ark. And it is the thing that most versions of this story never allow to fully land. Survival does not simplify a person. It does not resolve them into a clear lesson or a clean example or a straightforward moral to carry away. Survival complicates. It gives you the life after the thing. And the life after the thing is longer than the thing itself. Harder in some ways than the thing. And full of challenges the thing did not prepare you for. Because the thing was about getting through, and the life after is about figuring out what to do now that you have gotten through. Noah figured it out by planting a vineyard. That is a human response. Not a holy one in the polished sense that we sometimes use the word holy. Not an unholy one in the simple sense that we sometimes use the word unholy. A human one. The response of a man who needed something to tend and something to produce and something that would, in time and with patience, give him back a kind of relief that nothing else in his new world was providing. The vineyard gave him wine. The wine gave him the uncovering. The uncovering revealed what was underneath. And what was underneath was the same wound that had always been underneath. Not a wound the flood gave him. A wound he came into the flood with, that he carried through the flood, that he carried out of the flood. The wound that is simply the condition of being a human being in a world that is not what it was made to be. Carrying a nature that is bent from youth in the direction that God acknowledged and chose not to alter by force. Noah had that wound. He came into the ark with it. He came out of the ark with it. He lived with it for 350 years. He died with it, like everyone else. And this is the third thing this story insists on. The thing that Babel proved and the vineyard illustrated and the table of nations catalogued without comment. The flood could wash the earth. It could not wash what was in the human heart. The corruption that filled the world before the water was not a property of the geography. It was not stored in the cities or the buildings or the roads or the accumulated structures of the civilization that the flood erased. Those were the expressions of what was in the heart. You can erase expressions without erasing what is being expressed. The flood proved this. Once. Definitively. So it would not need to be proved again. And the God who understood this before the water was sent, who said in his heart over Noah's altar that the intention of man's heart is evil from its youth, made the covenant not because the proof had surprised him, but because the proof had settled something. Destruction cannot reach what needs to be reached. The answer is something else. Something that does not come from outside but works from within. Something that does not erase the wound but addresses its source. Something that does not wash the heart clean by flooding the earth but transforms the heart by inhabiting it. That something is not named in the Noah story. The Noah story is not the place in the Bible where that something is named. It is the place where the need for that something is established beyond any further argument, where the question is posed in terms large enough to require an answer that the rest of the Bible spends the next several thousand pages working toward. And here is what I want to say about that question before we finish. It is still being asked, not as a theological abstraction, as the lived experience of every person who has ever survived something enormous and stepped out onto the empty ground on the other side and built an altar and then planted a vineyard and discovered that the thing they survived did not take with it the thing that made the surviving necessary. You know what I mean. Not the event. The thing inside the event. The thing inside you that was there before the event and was there after it, and that no amount of surviving, no amount of distance from the worst of it, has fully addressed. That thing is what the flood could not wash away. It is not unique to Noah. It is not the property of people who have survived catastrophes of biblical scale. It is the common inheritance of every human being who has ever been honest about the gap between who they want to be and who they are when the door is closed and no one is watching. Noah is not a figure from a distant and unrelatable past. He is the most honest portrait in all of ancient literature of what it actually looks like to be a human being. To have something genuinely good in you and something genuinely wounded in you, and for both of those things to be fully present at the same time, neither canceling the other out, neither waiting politely for the other to finish before making itself known. The altar and the vineyard are not two different Noahs. They are the same man. And the same man is every person who has ever stood at a place of genuine orientation and genuine failure and had to figure out what to make of holding both of them. Now here is the question that the story of Noah leaves. Not the question about the science of the flood, or the archaeology of the ark, or the mechanics of loading two of every kind. Those questions exist, and they matter, and serious people engage them seriously. But they are not the question the story is asking. The question the story is asking is the one that Noah's life poses by its shape. What direction are you going? Not in the dramatic sense of the great life choices that define a biography. In the daily, unglamorous, unwitnessed sense of the orientation that accumulates into a direction over time. The small choices, the private moments, the thousand unremarkable decisions that no genealogy records and no narrative preserves, but that, over time, add up to either a life going one direction or a life going another. Noah's life is not recorded because it was spectacular. The spectacular part lasts a few chapters. The rest of it is a man in a vineyard. Noah's life is recorded because the orientation it embodied was the one thing in the entire pre-flood world that the looking could find. Not the only good thing, not the only person trying, but the one whose trying had accumulated, quietly and without record, into a direction that could be found when the finding mattered most. Before the ark, before the flood, before any of the things that we call the story of Noah. The story of Noah begins in the unrecorded years of a man walking with God in a world that was not. The bow is still in the cloud. Every time the rain ends and the light bends through the water in the air and the color appears above the cleared horizon, it is still there. The weapon of judgment, aimed upward. The sign of the decision to stay. The most universal promise ever made. Directed at every creature that breathes. Requiring nothing from the ones it covers except the fact of their breathing. God decided to stay in the question rather than resolve it by force. And the question is still open. And somewhere in the silence between the end of the rain and the appearance of the color in the sky, the answer is being given by someone who may not even know they are giving it. The way Noah gave it. Without a word. With a direction. With the daily, accumulated, unspectacular fact of a life that was still going the right way when the looking looked. That is what the water could not wash away. Not the wound. Something older than the wound. Something in the orientation of a man who walked with God in a world that was not walking that way. And who kept walking, even when the walking led through the end of the world and out the other side into a vineyard and a tent, and 350 more years and 2 words at the end. He kept walking, in the direction he had always been going. The bow is in the cloud. The question is still open, and the same direction is still available, to anyone still going it.